Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Ruthless Aggression Era podcast. After about a 2 week hiatus, we are back and better than ever. As always, I'm your host, Mel Matt, and sorry if the audio on my end is a bit off or not as good as it usually is. My regular microphone is broken at the moment, so I have to use my laptop microphone, but hopefully this can work out pretty well. So I'm here at last after 2 long weeks. The podcast is back, and tonight I have a returning guest.
Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, peoples of the earth. I am Biff Kensington III. How are you, good buddy?
I'm good. How about you?
Been a heck of a week, but thankful that it's the weekend and ready to get on through this summer and get some cool temperatures and a little bit more pleasant weather back. It's been a little unsettled here, so.
Yeah, I just came back from Florida, and that was kind of a roller coaster ride, to say the least, in terms of weather. Because for the first few days, it was kind of sprinkling, but it was also kind of normal as well. Then around the last couple of days, it started to get really, really sunny.
Yeah, I bet the humidity was rough down there.
Oh yeah,
A special hello to all our friends listening in from Florida. You live in an oven, so.
yeah. I feel them on that. I feel them on that. And so today, it's going to be a pretty interesting topic today because we're going to be looking at the first ever book on the podcast. We're going to be talking about Hulk Hogan's very first autobiography, Hollywood Hulk Hogan. And Biff, the reason I chose you for this episode is that you have a podcast with Tigger's Minion and the Legends Lover, where you talk about old school wrestling, connoisseurs of wrestling, every Sunday. And so I wanted you on this podcast. I figured, Hulk Hogan, a big old school name, more or less. And did you know about this book when it came out, or?
I did. I actually was not. I did not own the book, but I read the book. I had a friend in college who was a mega fan of Hulk Hogan, and he let me borrow this book. It's been quite a number of years, but it was right around the same time that we got the Hulk Still Rules DVD. So it was kind of a package deal almost. Very interesting book to say the least. You can say what you will about Hulk Hogan, but one thing you can't say is that he's uninteresting. Whether you love him, you hate him, you're indifferent towards him, he's definitely led quite an interesting career and an interesting life in the public eye.
Yeah, I think that's the case as well. And I actually do own the book as well. I think I got it when I don't know if it was when it first came out, but it was like maybe a year or so back when the book was still relatively new. So I've had it for years and I've read it a million times. So I definitely know the book inside and out.
Yeah, it's Hogan. If you've ever seen his documentaries, you kind of get the sense of what you're getting into when you are kind of studying on Hogan's career and his life. And so it's one of those deals where, you know,
You there, Biff? Biff? I think Biff may have I don't know what happened to Biff. His audio seemed to cut out. Um, but yeah, I'm talking about Hulk Hogan's book. I've had it for years, ever since it came out, and so I'm very familiar with the book. And so I guess we can go ahead and start with chapter one. which is called Rock in a Hard Place. And it's basically an overture of the book, basically previewing everything that's going to happen later on in the book, and a strange interaction with Vince backstage right before WrestleMania 18, right before the match with The Rock. And he says, quote, "Everybody screws with me, brother. My wife makes me work hard. My kids make me crazy. The government screws with me. The IRS screws with me. And sometimes you screw with me, Vince. But out there, that's that's my house, and nobody can mess with me. Now I'm going out there to collect my money. I'll see you when I'm done." He says all of that to Vince, and it is so weird.
I apologize for that. I had a bit of a technical snafu there.
Oh, hey, Biff, you're back.
Yeah, I accidentally closed out my internet browser for some reason, so I had to log back on. I apologize about that.
Yeah, that's fine. I was wondering what happened.
Like I told you kind of before we went on the air, I am not all there tonight. So I was just sitting there talking, and all of a sudden I realized that nobody is talking back, and I looked, and the computer screen is like blank. So I apologize about that. We shouldn't have any more troubles here.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Did you hear what Hogan apparently said to Vince right before WrestleMania 18, his match with Rock?
I did not. I caught the very tail end of it, but if I'm not mistaken, it's something to do about Hogan and trying to get the decision of the match decided, something about the money. I caught the very tail end.
Yeah, this is such a strange interaction because it comes right out of nowhere. He says, quote, "Everybody screws with me, brother. My wife makes me work hard. My kids make me crazy. The government screws with me. The IRS screws with me. And sometimes you screw with me, Vince. But out there, that's my house, and nobody can mess with me. Now I'm going out there to collect my money. I'll see you when I'm done."
It was like I was saying, you can't say he hasn't led an interesting life. I mean, it's definitely not the kind of reaction that most people would have towards Vince. You know, it's definitely kind of a unique perspective, to say nothing else.
Yeah, no, definitely not. I mean, it's very. I think Hulk Hogan has a very special relationship with Vince.
Yeah, it's always been one that's half acrimonious and half friendly. I think that's really, you can't talk about Hulk Hogan without talking about Vince McMahon, because the way that Hogan and Vince have had a relationship over the last 30 plus years now is almost, an insight into who Vince McMahon is. A lot of people assume that the relationship between Hogan and Vince is really frosty, but in reality, I think Vince has a sort of respect for Hogan. He understands, that Hogan is a businessman. And I think as long as you're fair and upfront to Vince about that, Vince will generally do business with you. And I mean, we see that when you have all these people that come back to the company years after they were apparently blacklisted and could never get back. And then here comes Jeff Jarrett in the Hall of Fame, or, Randy Savage gets into the Hall of Fame after he passes. And so it's almost a window into how Vince is when you look at the relationship he's had with Hogan over the years, and it's kind of been on again, off again.
Yeah, I think so as well. Because the thing with all of that is, like, in this business, you can really never say never, because guys like Savage and Ultimate Warrior and guys like that, Bret Hart, have had so many burned bridges and all of that, but they ended up coming back in some form or another. So I think Vince, I think what you said is correct. I think if Vince sees that he can draw money with you, he'll work with you. He might not necessarily like you, but if you can help him draw money, I think at the end of the day, that's what matters.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that Vince because of some of the stuff that's happened in the WWF and the WWE over the last, couple decades since he's been running it, we have this perception of Vince as kind of this, caricature on TV of what he really is in real life. And I think that, the actual Vince McMahon, the one that's, away from the spotlight, the one that you see behind the scenes, is not necessarily the same one that you see on TV. I think that's a misconception that a lot of people have, that Vince is this evil, manipulative billionaire. Now, he's definitely a businessman first and foremost, and he is always going to put his company above all others. But I don't think that the Vince McMahon character on TV is necessarily an accurate representation of who Vince McMahon is. Now, there have been accusations against Vince. There's accusations against Hogan, of course, all the stuff that he went through. But, wrestling is weird in that way that it's hard to tell where the character stops and where the real person begins. I think there's blurred lines for a reason. It almost, kind of creates another layer to the whole art form that is pro wrestling.
Yeah. Yeah, I hate these blurred lines.
No Robin Thicke ever.
But yeah, I see what you're saying. There's definitely a fine line between the character that you see on TV and the real life person. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it seems like those lines can blend together pretty well, but I think there is a fine line between character and reality.
Yeah, I agree.
So we move on to chapter 2, growing up, and this is basically a chapter that talks about Hulk Hogan growing up. Says that his parents first met in the Panama Canal Zone. Panama, Panama,
The scary thing, if you're a longtime fan, you actually know what Hogan's parents looked like because they were at Madison Square Garden the night he won the championship. So,
were they?
Oh yeah, all those longtime fans, Pete and Ruth Hogan, if my memory serves me correctly.
Yep.
So, yeah. So get that thought out of your head, why don't you?
So his dad worked in construction, and his mom was a secretary for the Navy. His brother Alan was always getting in trouble, always, street fighting and all that stuff.
Well, those mean streets of Tampa where he grew up and where he learned all of his lingo, apparently. So.
Yeah, that's yeah, speaking of that, there's going to be a rather interesting anecdote later on in the book. So, but yeah, Hogan as a kid would stuff rocks up his nose.
I feel like there's a cocaine joke in there somewhere, but I am not qualified to make it. I'll leave that up to someone else's more capable hands. So.
By Tony Montana.
There you go. I mean, it was the 80s, so that's apropos for the discussion of Hogan, I guess.
He also played baseball and bowled, and he started watching wrestling around age 6 or 7 and idolized Dusty Rhodes.
Yeah, I mean, you could actually see that in some of Hogan's promos, that kind of frenetic chemistry, the frenetic charisma that he used to have. It's a Dusty Rhodes quality in a lot of ways. And it's, makes a lot of sense. I mean, Dusty Rhodes was huge in Florida in the 70s. I don't think people today understand just how big Dusty Rhodes was. He was basically the Hulk Hogan of his era in the 70s. So, and Florida was his home base of operations.
Yeah, you can just see a Dusty Rhodes kind of inspiration whenever he would talk. You know, his promos were very Dusty-ish.
Yeah, that kind of that million miles an hour. You know, Dusty Rhodes used to have a certain way about giving promos where he was, you know, talking so fast that every, you know, 10 to 15 seconds would be punctuated by this deep gasping breath where he's trying to like suck air in so he can keep talking at 50 miles an hour. And then a lot of his promos in the 80s were the same way. I mean, he would, once he got started, it was just a million miles an hour. You know, he just had the advantage over people like the Ultimate Warrior, where he was talking about stuff that half the way made sense, as opposed to the Ultimate Warrior, who generally made no sense, but it sounded cool. And that was kind of the frenetic energy that Hogan had, and Dusty Rhodes had it too. So it's kind of interesting how he pulls that reference out in the book, because you could see it through his career where the influence actually came into play.
Yeah, totally. So we go on to chapter 3, which is the ranch, and it's just a very brief chapter that talks about him more or less becoming a Christian as a teenager.
That was actually the subject of a documentary that A&E did on him actually a couple of years ago too, if I'm not mistaken. I know when he was wrestling in the early days of the WWF, he would do the sign of the cross, so I always kind of assumed he was Catholic. But it is kind of interesting for him to talk about that in his book. I know it would come back up later in life too, after he went through a bout of depression, before the whole Gawker scandal blew up too. So it is what it is, I guess.
Yeah. So we move on to chapter 4, music, money, and Matsuda. Hogan played in a band called Infinity's End in high school. So Hulk Hogan is a musician, which, you know, and there was that time where Hogan claimed to audition for Metallica, which I don't believe at all. But, you know, considering that he was a musician, I suppose it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. But it is interesting that Hulk Hogan, you know, at one point was a musician.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that he got his leg broken when he was training. Now, and I'm going to go ahead and second your opinion on the whole Metallica business. That's kind of what I was saying at the outset of the show. You got to kind of take some of these claims with a grain of salt. I mean, he once claimed that Andre the Giant weighed 900 pounds during their match at WrestleMania 3, which would make that, you know, one of the most impressive deadlifts in history, you know, if Hogan actually pulled that off. But it's really fascinating. Hogan, with the long hair, he was always into kind of the bodybuilding physique. He always had a really strong physique, a really big muscular frame. But the long hair and the attitude that he brought from the music world when he was playing with his bands, that rubbed people in Florida, Florida Championship Wrestling or Championship Wrestling from Florida, the wrong way. And so one of the ways that the people that trained wrestlers during this era would weed out kind of the fake people that really weren't going to be able to cut it was to stretch them, to, you know, intentionally hurt them a little bit. And Hogan, to his credit, this story's been told a million times over, he came back. Hiro Matsuda was a trainer. He did some guest spots for WCW in 1989. Managed Ric Flair for a time after J.J. Dillon left. Very, very tough man, very capable of beating the crap out of you. He broke Hogan's leg, and Eddie Graham wanted to see if Hogan would come back. And to his credit, he healed up and he came back. And so the rest, they say, is history. But training with Hiro Matsuda was no joke. It's nothing compared to what people at the Performance Center go through today. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, and he even says in the book that, you know, Toughen Up was like a babysit service compared to Matsuda.
Yeah, Matsuda was the real deal. You didn't mess with Matsuda. You got on his bad side, you paid for it with a broken bone. So
Yeah, so, and he even talks about it in this book. Matsuda breaks Hogan's leg his first day. What Hogan says in this book, before I knew it, Matsuda was sitting down between my legs and putting his elbow in the middle of my shin. Then he grabbed the end of my toe and twisted my foot until, crack, my shin bone broke in half.
Now, I don't know the mechanics of breaking a shin bone in half like that. I mean, it's varied from person to person over the years. Some people say broke his leg. Some people say it was a snapped ankle. But there is at least, documented evidence that he did, in fact, suffer some sort of break. Whether it was his shin bone in half, that, again, Hogan stretching the truth a little bit maybe, but I mean, at the end of the day, he still, was pretty much tortured to make sure that he really wanted to be a wrestler. So, it was a gruesome little process, but that's how it used to be in the old days. Maybe not quite that graphic everywhere, but it's definitely not outside of the realm of possibility.
Yeah, and it also leads to one of the. It also leads to one of the one of the weirdest out of context quotes out of the book. It says, "quote Now I understand he did the right thing by breaking my leg."
I don't think those words have been uttered too awful much in the course of human history, but if that's how he feels, that's how he feels. So, I think I would rather keep the function on my legs, to be honest.
Yeah, same here. I don't know how it would feel to have a bone broken. I imagine it doesn't feel too good.
No, it doesn't. I've been fortunate. I've had some muscle tears before. The only broken bone I've ever had was actually a bone in my neck. So, but that really wasn't so much pain as it was just kind of shock. I know my brother has actually broken his arm before. He said it was quite unpleasant. So I'm going to take his word for it. I don't need to experience it firsthand to know that I don't much care for it. But I mean, again, Hogan got his leg broke and he came back. So apparently he wanted to wrestle, pretty badly to come back after getting your leg broke. And I would say it worked out fairly well for him.
Yeah, I would say so as well. The Briscoe brothers got enjoyment out of the training sessions, and Eddie Graham admits to Hogan that wrestling is a work.
Yep. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever had a chance to read Ric Flair's book before, his autobiography?
I read it a long time ago.
He has a similar story to Hogan, except Rick, he didn't find out about wrestling until he was going out for his first match. He was actually told heading out what he was supposed to do. Up until that point, Ric Flair claims he didn't know wrestling was work. And apparently Taz said something to a similar effect. He didn't know wrestling was a work until he went out for his first match. And so it apparently was one of the common themes to keep guys in the dark about wrestling until the very last possible moment. And it's really weird. You look at it today and everybody, even young kids, kind of recognize that wrestling is fake because they don't pretend anymore. It was an entirely different ball game. Kayfabe, as it's called, it was very serious for these people. It was their livelihood in the days before wrestling was kind of exposed to everybody. And, we kind of got into this discussion at Cage Side about Jim Cornette and people from that era that take it so seriously today. It's one reason why they have such a serious bug about, taking wrestling serious, because it was serious for them. I mean, can you imagine going in for a job, training for weeks and months, a job where you've already sacrificed a broken leg for to begin with, and you don't even fully understand the job that you're doing? It's crazy to think about what people like Hogan had to go through just to get into the business. It's real insanity.
Yeah, it is crazy. And I actually am planning on reviewing Ric Flair's book, To Be the Man, at some point during the podcast. I'm actually going to try and get Taker's Minion to be on that episode.
Oh, you'll have a lot of fun on that one. Taker has a lot of good perspective on Ric Flair, so that'd be a good episode.
That's why I want to get him on there because I know he's going to have a, like you said, have a good perspective on Ric Flair. I think Flair might be one of his favorites, so I think he would do a good episode on that book.
Yeah. Well, that and Undertaker, obviously, but
Yeah.
yeah, we don't want Taker to get upset at us. Undertaker, it's kind of in the name there, but
Yeah.
he's got room in his heart for Ric Flair too, I'm sure. So,
I mean, Undertaker apparently did get an Instagram account not very recently.
you know what? I'm going to be very interested to hear Taker's opinion on that tomorrow morning.
Yeah.
I don't know how he's going to feel about Undertaker with an Instagram account.
But yeah, someone needs to bring it up to him.
I'll do my part. I'll bring it up, and I'll get some good comedy out of that for everybody. So you just hang tight on that one. So
we move on to chapter 5, my career as a bouncer, and Hogan talks about being a bouncer one night and getting a bottle smashed over his head.
A surprisingly common career, a vocation for wrestlers in the 80s was be a bouncer. I think, the famous story of Scott Hall, he actually had a justifiable homicide as a bouncer. I guess it was a matter of, you're big, you're strong, you're tough. You have to be tough to be a professional wrestler. So, what other jobs are you going to have that require some of those same skill sets? And apparently being a bouncer at a bar was one of them. Seems like everybody in the 80s that was a big name, after the fact had some time spent in a bar as a bouncer.
Yep. And so we move on to chapter 6, my first detour. And Hogan's first ever match was as the Masked Super Destroyer against Brian Blair.
Killer Bee, Brian Blair. Longtime fans will remember him with the Killer Bees, one of the most weird-looking tag teams in history. So,
yeah, Hogan briefly quit wrestling and opened a gym called Waddy and Terry's Olympic Gym, and Brutus Beefcake and Leslie helped him run it, though the gym closed not too long after.
It would, for the sake of wrestling, it's interesting that gym did not last. Ed Leslie had quite a career for himself, not quite Hogan's level, but he's still a household name for fans that were watching during the era of Hulk Hogan. So I would say that it was fortuitous for them that they got back into the wrestling business.
Yeah, I mean, and if it wasn't for them running that gym, Ed Leslie would have never main evented Starrcade.
Now, why did you have to go and remind me of that, dude? That's not. That's gonna have to self-medicate again. I had bad memories here. As far as I'm concerned, Starrcade died in '93. Everything that came after was just kind of a fake Starrcade. So,
anyway. Why did it die in '93 to you?
Because Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake is not a Starrcade main event. You could talk for hours on Starrcade. So I don't want to get too far off the proverbial reservation here, but Starrcade was a WrestleMania level event in the 80s, but people have documented how badly WCW screwed Starrcade up. It's a quite fascinating story. If you're listening to this, I would highly recommend you kind of look up the story behind what happened to Starrcade and how it kind of changed the wrestling business. Hulk Hogan actually kind of ties into this in '87. It kind of plays into the WWF's hand on pay-per-view and everything. But be that as it may, Starrcade in '93 was a lot different from the Starrcades that you would get in, say, 1983. It just kind of wasn't the same. And I think Hogan going into WCW, which I'm sure, we'll talk about here in a little while, it's a very interesting phase of his career, and it's a very interesting phase in WCW's history as well.
Yeah, so we move on to chapter 7, kayfabe, and Hogan talks about the art of kayfabe.
Yep, it was daily life in that era. You lived it 24/7, and if you didn't, you got fired. It's not a matter of getting suspended or getting in trouble with your boss. If you didn't keep kayfabe in the early '80s, you were fired out of a job, and it was very hard for you to find a different one. So that's kind of what we were saying earlier. It was a completely different business at that point, and wrestlers had far different responsibilities than they do today.
Yeah, and it was always kind of weird to me. The kayfabe, like I don't know. I just thought that after a while, people were eventually going to find out.
Well, one of the things that helped keep it alive is the fact that media distribution in the 60s, the 70s, and the early 80s was a lot different than it is today, or it even was in the late 80s. We live I don't know how old you are. I'm in my early 30s, and so I can still remember when networks used to sign off at night. I'm just barely old enough to be an old fogey like that, but it's hard for us today in a world where you have YouTube that you could stream stuff on, or social media where you're connected to celebrities in a famous way, and if you have cable still, you've got 5,000 channels or satellite TV. There's so many ways to absorb information and entertainment now that in the 80s, especially the early 80s, you were still lucky if you only had 4 or 5 channels in some places. Some places only had 1 or 2, depending on how remote they were. And, if you lived in, let's say I live in Charlotte, you live in Charlotte, you're not going to get a lot of the stuff that people in Richmond get, or the stuff that people in Washington, D.C. get, or Atlanta. Your world is pretty much restricted to that little bubble. You had the national networks that they had their news in the evenings. That was it. Everything else was local. And so for wrestling fans, outside of getting magazines, which kept kayfabe, the only source of information you had was your local promotion, if you had one. And so it was easy for kayfabe to exist in that era because, what a wrestler did in Georgia was not going to be something that fans watching in, say, Chicago knew all about. You could go from Georgia Championship Wrestling to the AWA and not have to worry about, people saying, well, you've done this before. Wrestling's fake. It's like a traveling circus. You're kind of there and gone before people can really figure out what's going on. That, and it was a more naive time too. So
yeah, definitely all good points.
Yeah. So
we move on to chapter 8, Pensacola, Alabama, Atlanta, and Tennessee. Hogan talks about working the southern territories at this point in time. Hogan calls superstar Billy Graham and says that his arms are bigger than his. And Louis Tillett books him and Ed Leslie on the southern Pensacola, Alabama territory.
If you ever get a chance to go on YouTube, there is a video. Now, this specific video is from Memphis, but it's right at the same time where he's wrestling Continental, which is kind of that Gulf Coast wrestling Continental in Alabama. It's kind of the same area that he's talking about. There's a video on YouTube where the camera is doing these slow pans over Hulk Hogan's body parts. And the guy doing the narration is just gushing over how big Hogan is. You look at that and you have to think that somewhere Vince McMahon has that tape stuffed in like a lockbox somewhere where he pops it out whenever he's a hit. So it's on YouTube, or at least it was at one point. You probably still find it, but Hogan's physique was always kind of worked into his character, even as a heel. It was always kind of, he was produced as like this stunning work of human art, the way that his bodybuilding had kind of reshaped himself. So it's a little unsettling, actually. to see them kind of gush over how big his legs are, especially the slow pan up towards his crotch and everything. It was a little bit unsettling.
And Hogan also says that Louis Tillett had dentures that he sucked cheese out of when he ate at McDonald's.
I have no comment on that one. So.
It is a weird anecdote that he put in the book.
There are some things that just stand without needing extra commentary. I think that's one of them. So.
And Hogan wrestled as a face named Terry Boulder. And Hogan talks about the Jerry Lawler Andy Kaufman feud in Memphis and calls Andy Kaufman's comedy style boring.
Andy Kaufman is such an interesting character in the history of wrestling, an interesting person to be sure. It is really weird to think that, at the same time Andy Kaufman was doing his business in Memphis, that Hogan was kind of on the periphery of the Memphis wrestling scene at this time. It kind of makes you realize, how small the wrestling world actually could be looking back in hindsight.
Yeah, so we move on to Chapter 9, The Docks. And Hogan worked odd jobs as part of a laborers union. And Terry Funk gets Hogan to meet Vince Sr. in Allentown.
Allentown, Pennsylvania. One of the old studio areas where they would film wrestling. Very memorable look. If you're a fan of the WWF from the 70s and 80s, you'll remember Allentown set up very well.
Yep, so Chapter 10, New York. You won't regret it. Vince Sr. tells Hogan to take that tie-dye crap off because he doesn't want Hogan to be associated with Billy Graham, and tells him that if he goes to New York, he won't regret
it. He regretted it a little bit the first time. He didn't regret it the second time, I guarantee you that. His bank account certainly didn't regret it. So.
Well, an incident happens in New Jersey where Hogan gets pulled over by the cops for an unregistered gun in his car, and the Wild Samoans who was traveling at the time weren't really of any help because they didn't want to break kayfabe at that point in time.
Yeah, this was, if you're a younger fan, this was back in the day when you would rather go to jail for an unregistered gun than break kayfabe. That's what we're kind of talking about. It was serious to them. They did not want to let on to the fact that, they are intelligent people that could have a conversation like anyone else. They had their gimmick and they wanted to portray it. Do you think it's worth telling the story about how Hogan actually got his name with Vince Sr.? You think that's a story worth telling here?
Yeah, I think so.
Hulk Hogan, because you mentioned just a moment ago that Hogan was known by a couple of different names. He came in under a mask at first in Florida, and then he was Terry Boulder, and then at one point he was Sterling Golden, which kind of sounds like a porn star's name. He used to have an atom bomb shape in his chest hair. He shaved his chest hair so it looked like an atom bomb when he was with Freddie Blassie. There's a famous photo of him backstage where he's got the atom bomb design on his chest, which, it is what it is. But one of the things that Vince Sr. in particular liked, and what he kind of built his business around, was the ethnic characters. If you live in New York, maybe not as much today. I mean, it was definitely a thing in the 70s and 80s, and I'm sure it probably still is to some extent. But the enclaves of different cultures in New York, the Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn, or the Jewish neighborhood, or the Russian neighborhood, or, the black neighborhood, or whatever, the different enclaves in New York would all have their favorite wrestlers, Greek Americans, Spiros Arian. Puerto Rican fans, they really liked Pedro Morales. And so in the WWF era, it was very common for these ethnic characters to kind of come in and represent different sections of the population, because in New York, of course, and in other major cities in the Northeast, you had these larger communities where you had all sorts of different cultures kind of combining into, the one homogenous whole. Hogan comes in, and he's not called Hogan at this point, but he's given the name Hogan because Vince Sr. wanted to create an Irish character. He wanted to appeal to Irish fans that were coming to Madison Square Garden. So Hogan gets the Hogan name for that reason. He was actually supposed to be another ethnic character as part of Vince Sr.'s plan to kind of attract Irish American fans. So that's how he ended up with the name Hulk Hogan. The Hulk part, of course, because of his size and his muscular physique, but that's how he got the name Hogan.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. Logan actually does say in the book that he did a show of some kind with Lou Ferrigno, who at the time was the Incredible Hulk on the TV show, and he said, "Well, I'm the real Hulk," and he says that the nickname just kind of stuck.
Yeah, if you ever watch old WWF tapes, especially the early Coliseum videotapes, if you're a longtime fan, you'll remember Coliseum video. If you watch at the end of those tapes, they used to have credits that would roll at the end of the videos. They don't do credits anymore, but used to be credits that would roll, and they would have little copyright disclaimers at the end of the video. It'd be like, Titan Sports, copyright 1985 or whatever. Originally, they would have to put on the copyright mark for Marvel because Vince Jr. had to start licensing the name Incredible Hulk for Hulk Hogan. So it's kind of interesting, Marvel, of course, is this huge entity now with this MCU, but back in the 80s, WWF had to work with Marvel so that Hulk Hogan could keep the Hulk name.
Yeah, I mean, and when go on.
It was like, Terry Hogan sounds like a mechanic down the street, whereas Hulk Hogan kind of has a connotation of being, the personification of a wrestler from the 80s. So it's funny how it worked out like that.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like a wrestler's name, to say the least.
Yeah, definitely.
And so when Hulk Hogan was brought into the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, he was supposed to be the Irish American wrestler because Bruno Sammartino was the Italian American, Pedro Morales was the Puerto Rican American, Ivan Chief J Strongbow for the Native Americans, and Ivan Putski for the Polish Americans. So he was supposed to be the Irish American for WWF, and he was supposed to dye his hair red, which would be so weird.
Can you imagine Hulk Hogan having red hair?
I honestly could not.
Imagine Hulk Hogan going on MTV or Saturday Night Live in 1985 with red hair. It almost happened, folks. It almost happened.
Yep, so Chapter 11, Life in Worldwide Wrestling. Hogan worked as a heel with Freddie Blassie as his manager.
Freddie Blassie does not get as much love as Bobby Heenan, but for my money, up until Bobby Heenan, Freddie Blassie was probably the greatest manager in wrestling history.
The Fashion Plate.
Yes. The Hollywood Fashion Plate, Freddie Blassie. His famous little cut down on people called them pencil neck geeks. Freddie Blassie was a very big name in wrestling. Unfortunately, he was kind of winding down in the business right as it took off. So I don't think people today kind of appreciate, how important he actually was. But, it was important for Hogan to kind of be attached to him as a heel because it gave him some credibility. Just like, Bobby Heenan would give credibility to the people he managed later on during Hogan's run in the WWF. and earlier in the AWA. I don't want to forget Bobby's contribution there. But it was important for Hogan to be attached to Freddie Blassie because it showed that Vince Sr., had big plans for him. You weren't going to get Captain Lou or Freddie Blassie to manage you unless the company wanted to do big things with you.
Yeah, and fans ended up rioting when Hulk Hogan beat Gorilla Monsoon in just 38 seconds.
Now, I have never seen that match. That match would be a fascinating social experiment to see, especially if you're a longtime Hogan fan and you remember Gorilla Monsoon gushing over him later on. It would be a trip and a half to see Hogan and Gorilla wrestling each other, especially in a match that quickly.
Yeah, it was pretty much designed to put over Hulk Hogan because Gorilla Monsoon was sort of winding down his in-ring career at that point.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that Gorilla was wrestling that late. I thought he had retired 1979, 1980, but apparently he went a little bit longer than I thought. By the time Hogan would come back for his second stint in the WWF in '84, he was definitely into his commentating role, and he wasn't actively wrestling anymore at that point. So it's kind of interesting how far Gorilla actually did go into his career.
Yeah, but and this detail is something that's pretty interesting considering now um, that the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and New Japan Pro Wrestling had a working relationship.
Yeah, there was a lot of cooperation during this point between promotions in Japan and promotions here in the States. It fluctuated from year to year depending on kind of the wins, I guess. There was points in time where the NWA would have relationship with All Japan Pro Wrestling. Occasionally, they would have a relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Hogan actually, he really became the first. His first big run, let's say, was actually in Japan. Um, a lot of people don't know this, and we'll talk about it here in a little bit when we get towards his run as WWF champion. But up until about 85, 86, somewhere in there, Hulk Hogan made more money from his wrestling in Japan than he did wrestling in the United States. And so you can't talk about Hulk Hogan without talking about his time in New Japan Pro Wrestling because, Hogan was huge in Japan. And it's one of the big reasons that Hogan wound up having so much success over here in the AWA and the WWF was he became a big hit in Japan. And so people understood, this guy could be marketable in the right circumstance.
Yeah, I think even after he had even left WWF in '93, he was still wrestling in Japan.
Yeah, he would make guest shots. Actually, before he even left WWF, if you look on YouTube, he's got a match with the Great Muta from 1993, where he's actually got the WWF title with him as he goes to the ring. It's the famous show where he does the press conference after, where he calls it a toy. He calls the WWF Championship a toy, and he wants the IWGP Heavyweight Championship. So, yeah, even as he was wrestling in the WWF, Hulk Hogan would still make the occasional shot in Japan because there was a lot of money to be made there for him.
Yeah, and so we go to chapter 12, the deodorant cane, where Hulk Hogan talks about Iron Mike Sharpe being very hygienic.
Canada's favorite athlete. That's all I will say. Iron Mike Sharpe, probably one of the most visible job guys in wrestling, especially later on in the 80s and 90s. Very distinct look. He had kind of a famous match one time where he beat somebody so badly that it made their toupee fly off during the match. And the poor guy kept trying, and the poor guy kept spending the rest of the match trying to put his toupee back on, and the commentators are cracking up, trying not to bust out laughing. So that's Iron Mike Sharpe for you.
So we move on to chapter 13, the Giant, where Hulk Hogan talks about how he was originally rivals with Andre, because Bill Watts got pissed by Hulk Hogan because Hulk Hogan pretty much refused the job to Wahoo McDaniel was saying that Vince Sr. told him not to job to anybody. And so Andre ends up beating up Hulk Hogan at the Silverdome, or I mean the Superdome, brother.
Yeah. For the record, I would just like to throw this in here that Wahoo McDaniel once drank a quart of motor oil on a dare. Because Wahoo McDaniel was freaking immortal until the 1990s. And his hard living kind of caught up with him. But, I mean, Wahoo McDaniel, if Bill Watts, let's be clear here. Hulk Hogan, if Wahoo McDaniel wanted to win, Wahoo McDaniel was going to win. There wasn't nothing Hogan was going to do to stop Wahoo McDaniel from winning a match. But, Hogan probably would have been better off just taking the loss from Wahoo because you don't want the boss to get pissed off at you. Wahoo is tough, but Andre is a freaking tank. So it was definitely not Hogan's brightest moment, let's say.
No, and speaking of drinking, Hogan says that Andre would spend 8 to 10 hours in a restaurant, and that he would drink 12 bottles of wine in 2.5 hours and 108 beers in less than an hour.
Yep, it's the famous story about Andre's drinking. If you watch the documentary that HBO put out, they talked a little bit about it. The whole drinking 108 beers, that's never been substantiated, and I love this because Tim White talked about this at one point. It was never completely substantiated because the people drinking with Andre were seldom conscious at the finish to tell you how much he had actually drank. But yeah, Andre's legacy as a very famous drinker, that is not fiction. That actually is well earned. Just wanted to kind of throw that out there for people interested about Andre.
Yep, and Hogan claims that nobody cared about Larry Zbyszko and Bruno Sammartino at Shea Stadium, and that he and Andre the Giant were the true main event.
Lie from the pits of wrestling hell.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, too.
That is absolutely not true. We talked about this match a couple of weeks ago, actually, on our Sunday night show. Larry Zbyszko and Bruno Sammartino was the main event. That's what put 50-some thousand people at Shea Stadium. But Hogan and Andre, they were an attraction on that card. I don't want to diminish what they meant to that particular event. But Larry Zbyszko was, the king of heels for what he did to Bruno. And people wanted to see Bruno come back and kick his ass. And that's what Bruno did. So that's, just a falsehood right there that Hogan put in his book. But, that's just his perspective, even if it is incorrect.
Yeah, then we go to chapter 14, Stranger in a Strange Land. And Hogan basically quits WWF to go film Rocky 3 and ends up on Johnny Carson. And so, Hogan, filming Rocky 3, seems like a pretty big deal, at least back in that day.
This is, and it was a big deal. This is what basically turned Hogan into the mainstream star he would become. And it's the difference in the mindset from Vince Sr. to Vince Jr. Vince Jr. being the Vince McMahon we all know today. Vince Sr. did not want Hogan to do the movie because he did not like the connotation of wrestler as actors. Vince Jr. sees Hogan getting a lot of publicity for his role in Rocky 3, which, he's only in the movie for like 10 minutes. It's not like Hogan was like a co-star here of Sylvester Stallone in this or anything. But Vince Jr. sees the publicity that Hogan's getting, and he's like, this could be a big star for us. He's popular. People recognize him from the movie. I want to build around this guy. Well, Vince Sr., who was still in charge of the company at the time, did not want Hogan to do it. Hogan basically just left to go film the movie, which at the time, he didn't have to worry so much about the WWF because he had his Japanese wrestling commitments, and he would eventually move on into the AWA. So, turned out to be the right decision for Hulk to go and make that movie.
Yeah, and that ends up being the next chapter, chapter 15. Minnesota Wants Me. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show here on this episode, because you, Taker's Minion, and Legends Over actually did an entire episode covering the AWA.
Yeah, we had brought up some of the stuff from the AWA, a couple of different episodes talking with Bobby Heenan, which Heenan plays into a lot of the role that Hogan would have in the AWA. It's interesting, the dynamic of Hulk Hogan, the actual character, and we're not just using Hulk Hogan as the person here. The Hulk Hogan character that you remember from the WWF, the Age of Hulkamania, when he goes to the AWA, that's when the Hulkamania character really starts to get fleshed out. Now we're getting to the point in Hogan's career where the Hulk Hogan that people would recognize for years after is starting to come through. And the dynamic of Hogan in the WWF when he would be feuding with Bobby Heenan's top guys, throughout the 80s, that's really coming into focus here in the AWA when Hogan is trying to win the AWA title from Nick Bockwinkel. And of course, it's the famous story. Hogan kept seemingly winning the AWA title, and the decision would be reversed on a technicality, and it would go back. Depending on who you ask, either Hogan was not getting the merchandise money he thought he should, or Vern didn't think that he should put the title on him. The story has changed so much over the years. I'm of the mindset to believe that Hogan would have left regardless, because he didn't have direct ties to Minnesota. He's from Florida, so it's not like he was born in Minnesota and had some sort of loyalty to the AWA. I think once Vince Jr. kind of got into the picture in '84, I think Hogan really was going to go to New York. But his run in the AWA is very important, if for no other reason that it kind of really established Hogan as this super babyface that he would remain until 1996.
Yeah, so Hulk Hogan, it's doing a lot of things that it was sort of like the beginning of the Hulk Hogan we later go on to know in WWF, because he would come out with the theme music like Eye of the Tiger. He was creating Hulkamania shirts for his own, all that stuff. But the dissension begins when, Vern Gagne wants a percentage of Hogan's merch sale.
Yeah, and hindsight being 2020, I understand why Vern wanted to get a piece of that and why Greg wanted to get a piece of that. It's unfortunate that we lost the AWA, just like it's unfortunate we lost ECW and WCW, because wrestling is better when there's more than one company on the WWF's level, or WWE's level. Hindsight being 2020, they should have just given Hogan whatever he wanted, because they were going to make that money hand over fist. They didn't understand how big Hogan was going to get. Vince's background and his ability to kind of see the marketing aspect of Hulk Hogan is why the WWF wound up winning the war and becoming what it is today. But it was like I was saying, you can't separate what Hogan did in the AWA from what he would become in the WWF in the 80s, because it's in the AWA where he really starts to flesh out the Hulkamania gimmick that would become his bread and butter for years to come.
All right, I'm back. I had to go check on something.
No worries. But yeah, it's, you can't separate Hogan's success from the AWA. It's an important part of his career. And some of his best matches, too, with Nick Bockwinkel to boot. So it's well worth people's time going to search out some of his matches from AWA in '83 before he moved to New York.
Yeah, so we move on to chapter 16, Bullseye on My Back. And it basically talks about, how wrestlers could end up trying to injure Hogan to make a name for themselves.
This, there are so many urban legends about this. It was a big deal, not so much in the AWA. In the WWF in 84 and 85, it was a semi big deal. Um, we talked about kayfabe at the earlier part of the show and how you were kind of hemmed into your little geographic area and that's all you knew. The wrestling territories, the AWA was a territory, just like the WWF in 83 and 84 was a territory. It was based in the Northeast. You know, the territories kind of had these invisible boundaries that they weren't supposed to cross. Vince McMahon Sr. was not going to run shows any further south than Baltimore, Maryland. Jim Crockett in Mid-Atlantic was not going to run any shows beyond, West Virginia or Richmond, not at first at least. Vern Gagne was going to stay in the Midwest. Fritz von Erich was going to stay in the Dallas area. Bill Watts was going to stay in the Mid-South, the Louisiana area. These promotions were pretty static in their territories, their borders. That's why they're called territories. What Hogan and Vince McMahon Jr. did, our Vince McMahon, is they basically said, to hell with the borders. We're going to go wherever we want. And so that's why you get on the network, you go into some of the collections, you see Hulk Hogan wrestling in this really weird building in St. Louis called the Kiel Auditorium. Kind of had this Art Deco vibe to it. It's a really crazy looking place. But WWF was running shows in St. Louis, even though that wasn't part of their traditional territory. So when Hogan's talking about guys having it out for him, it's one of the reasons is Hogan and Vince McMahon Jr. are basically challenging the territorial system. They're really overturning the entire wrestling business in this country. It's what they're essentially doing in 84 and 85. But I do want to point out here, just for the sake of fairness, that it's a little overblown. Hogan talks about people out to get him or whatever. That was semi-true to an extent. There was some instances where Hogan would have to kind of protect himself a little bit. There's all sorts of wild rumors, like Iron Sheik was supposed to break Hogan's leg, which Iron Sheik at one point said was true, and then he kind of came clean and said it really wasn't true. And then you had Bruiser Brody was supposed to injure Hogan at one point. My God, that would have been a hell of a match. But by 86, really, this was not so much a big deal anymore because Hogan and the WWF got so big that they really kind of left all the territories in the dust, and no one ever truly caught them until WCW in 95. So, yeah, it is kind of true in a way what he says here in his book, but there's also a little bit of an exaggeration here again with Hogan.
Yeah, so we move on to chapter 17, Girl in the Red Onion, and this talks about the very first time that Hogan met his first wife, Linda.
Boy, did that not work out in the long run. That wound up not being, well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, he had children with her, but it was kind of weird how, when Hogan did his reality era show and everything, how the family was a big part of it, and that marriage to Linda did not end well for some of the stuff that Hogan did, but it was one of the reasons why he actually decided to go to New York again, which he's talked about in interviews, is he wanted to start a family, so he wanted to kind of get more money, which is what Vince Jr. was offering. And so it's partly because of him getting married that he wound up moving back to New York after he had the falling out with Vince's father.
Yeah. So we move on to chapter 18, Weird Wrestling Story, where Hogan recounts a time where he and Ed Leslie picked up a naked girl who had been thrown out of a car by a fellow wrestler in the cold snow.
I can't say for absolute certainty that this didn't happen. You would want to think that it didn't happen in reality, but at the same time, wrestlers were crazy during this period, and is not outside of the realm of possibility that something like this may have happened. You know, it's the context of it is really weird. Like, you talk about this kind of story today, and it has a completely different connotation and context than it may have had back in 2002, 2003 when he first wrote this book. But in terms of like Hogan's more memorable events and stories from his career, this is not necessarily what you would consider one of the highlights of it.
Yeah, pretty much agree with all of that.
Yeah. There's only so many ways you can kind of take that story. It's just kind of one of those things you don't really want to touch on too much, I guess. So.
Yeah. So chapter 19 called Vince McMahon. And Vince Jr. calls Hogan. He's taking over WWF, now calling it WWF, and wants Hogan to come over. And after Vern Gagne tries to make it his own Hulkamania shirts, Hogan decides to jump to WWF from AWA.
It was a good decision in the long run for Hogan. He definitely got bigger in New York than he was going to get in Minnesota. This is, you know, I talked earlier about how you don't really know Vince McMahon, and I kind of was alluding to the fact that Vince isn't necessarily as bad as people make him out to be, and I'm going to kind of contradict myself here because this actually is not one of the brightest moments in our Vince McMahon's life. The reason that Hogan came back to New York and with Vince McMahon Jr. was essentially Vince McMahon Sr. was dead. But Vince Jr. actually forced his father out of his own company. What Vince Jr. did, and from here on out, we could just say Vince McMahon and people know that we're talking about our Vince McMahon today. What Vince Jr. did was basically go behind his father's back, and he got some of his father's chief lieutenants in the company to turn on Vince Sr. And it basically pulled a power play, and it was real seedy stuff. And they forced Vince McMahon Sr. and his company, which was the Capital Wrestling Group, to sell to Vince McMahon Jr. and his Titan Sports. So if you ever hear WWE today referred to as Titan, this is where that's coming from. Vince Jr.'s company was called Titan Sports, and he basically forced a hostile takeover of what was then the WWF, and he kind of basically bullied his father out. And his father wound up passing away not long after due to, I believe it was bladder cancer. So Vince Sr. did not have a very good end to his life, and Vince Jr. kind of had a role to play in that. But in terms of Hulk Hogan had left Vince Sr.'s company when Vince Sr. was still in charge on very bad terms. He went and made Rocky III, like we talked about. Vince Jr. is in the picture now, and with Vince in control of the WWF, it was clear for Hogan to come back because Vince Jr. had an idea for Hogan to kind of become this big national star. And the rest, they say, is history. This is where Hulkamania really kind of takes off and becomes, you know, the icon that it is today. So it is just one of those interesting stories, you know, kind of how the misfortune of Vince Sr. turned into fortune for Hogan. It's really kind of weird to look back on that area, though, and think of it as a positive because you have, you know, Vince Sr. basically being forced out of the company he had pretty much founded. And then, you know, Hogan benefits from him being out of the picture. And so it's really weird how you look at Hulkamania and what it would become in the 80s and how it was kind of built on a family tragedy, essentially. But that's the wrestling business for you, I guess. So it kind of is what it is.
Yeah, so we move on to... Go on?
No, that was it. So
So we move on to chapter 20, Wedlock. And Hogan talks about how he married Linda and ended up falling asleep with a steak still in his hand.
I mean, it kind of is what it is on that front. So
we move on to chapter 21, Garden Party. And Hogan talks about Bob Backlund sort of being difficult to work with.
You know, it's really weird talking about Bob Backlund. If you listen to Dave Meltzer or you subscribe to Dave Meltzer's newsletter, he was not a fan of Bob Backlund. Apparently, there was some issues behind the scenes with Bob Backlund, but they've never really been elaborated on all that much. I've never been able to really uncover what was going on there. So if anybody listening may have any information, that would be kind of cool to hear about. But definitely Vince McMahon was not going to go with Bob Backlund as his champion. Bob Backlund was a good wrestler and he was a solid champion for a little while, but he was not the kind of guy that was going to go national. So that's a big reason why Hulk Hogan wound up coming in, and within a month of debuting again in WWF, he was champion. January 23rd, 1984, 5 minutes and 30 seconds. The winner of this bout and new World Wrestling Federation champion is Hulk Hogan. You can set your watch to that. Anyone that was watching in that era or anybody that's ever seen that match can recite the lines by heart. It's just kind of weird how that one title match at Madison Square Garden is such a seminal moment in wrestling history. It's kind of burned into your memory if you've ever seen it before.
Yeah, because Hogan, he does kind of like imply in the book that Backlund was kind of jealous that Hogan was coming in and essentially taking his spot as the top face and top champion in the company.
I mean, I would say that there's some merit to that because Bob wound up leaving not long after. I think the last match that Bob Backlund had for the WWF up until he came back in the 90s was in May of that year. So, you know, Hogan won the title for the first time in January, and Bob Backlund was gone a matter of weeks later. So, and it was completely understandable, too, because you have Bob Backlund, who's been champion for, you know, the better part of 6 years at that point. It would make sense for Bob not to want to stick around and see his replacement doing better. But then you get into kind of people that would talk about how the company was not doing well under Bob Backlund too. So it's all a matter of perspective. There are certain things that we're never going to know for absolute certainty. If you talk to someone like Larry Zbyszko, he is not very fond of Bob Backlund. He said he was an okay guy, but he never really drew well as champion. You know, there's definitely a gap between Bruno Sammartino and Hulk Hogan where business is kind of up and down for the company. You know, Bruno was their first true champion outside of Buddy Rogers, and Bruno was their biggest star for, 20 years. But then Hulk Hogan comes along and he kind of redefined what it means to be a star in wrestling in New York. So,
yeah, so we move on to chapter 22, John Stossel, and Hulk Hogan talks about the infamous incident between John Stossel and Dr. D.
Yep, Dr. D. David Schultz. If you have ever watched Stone Cold Steve Austin, that's kind of Dr. D. David Schultz, just not quite as. I'm trying to think of the right word here. I just completely had a mind blank. Dr. Well, yeah, to an extent. David Schultz was more of a redneck than Steve Austin was. Steve Austin called himself the Bionic Redneck, but that part of his persona was not as strong as it was with Dr. D. David Schultz. David Schultz was actually a very interesting wrestler. Now, he got blacklisted essentially for what happened with John Stossel. It's a very famous clip. Everybody's probably seen it where the reporter, John Stossel, says, "I think that this is fake." And David Schultz basically pancakes him across the face. he would allege that Vince McMahon Jr. actually told him to do that. And then I guess that's kind of why Vince and him had a falling out. But David Schultz was a very interesting character, and he had some memorable matches with Roddy Piper, actually, was kind of Roddy's partner in '84 before Roddy and Cowboy Bob Orton started teaming up a little bit. So David Schultz, that's another name from the past that's well worth going out of your way to find, because he was a very interesting person, to say the least.
So chapter 23, the load. Hogan talks about WWF slowly getting more popular, and Hogan claims that Harley Race once lit a ring on fire.
Unless Harley spilled his alcohol or something and accidentally lit it with a cigar, I don't know about lighting a ring on fire. Terry Funk has lit a few rings on fire before. But yeah, this is, 84, the summer of 84 is when the company really starts kind of spreading out a little bit. This is the point in time where you see the WWF, they're starting to run the Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis. You'll start to see them doing a few shots at the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago. This is, right in that time period where the company is starting to get mainstream publicity. It's also the point in time where Cyndi Lauper kind of starts working with the company a little bit. She was kind of partnered up with Wendy Richter for most of her time with the WWF. But she would also do some stuff with Hogan, especially as they got into 1985 and the Rock and Wrestling Connection kind of took off.
So Hogan talks about being a role model and about doing Make-A-Wish, and he also talks about riding motorcycles with Vince.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of footage out there. Vince and Hulk Hogan actually riding motorcycles. There's a picture. I can't remember if it was from a WWF magazine or something else, but you can see Hogan and Vince actually sitting on their respective motorcycles talking outside of what looks to be Hogan's home, or maybe Vince's home. It just depends on wherever they were. But yeah, that was actually part of the Hogan mystique. And you would even see that later on into the 80s and 90s, late 80s and 90s, as Hogan was getting ready to leave the WWF. You would always have these clips of him around where he's riding on a motorcycle. So he was the American Badass before the Undertaker was the American Badass. And Taker's going to beat me up for saying that. I'm sorry, Taker. I love you, buddy.
So we move on to chapter 24. It's not all fake. And Hogan recounts a time where Dan Spivey and Adrian Adonis had a fight backstage.
We just talked about Adrian Adonis this past Sunday, and it's weird to talk about Adrian Adonis and what he would become in 85 and 86. Because, by today's standards, it's quite an insulting stereotype that he portrayed. But if you can get past the stereotype, Adrian Adonis was a very good worker. Dan Spivey was possibly a lunatic. I would have paid money to see Adrian Adonis in his dresses fighting with Dan Spivey. That would have been interesting. Dan Spivey wound up being a tag team partner of Sid Vicious and would become a tag team partner of Mean Mark Callis, who, of course, would go on to become the aforementioned Undertaker. So if you're familiar with the Skyscrapers tag team, that's who Dan Spivey is.
A lot of Undertaker talk recently.
There's a lot of it's a love letter to Taker's minion. Just letting him know that I'm thinking about him getting some Undertaker talk in here. So
chapter 25, it's a sport, but it's also entertainment. Hogan talks about Vince, sort of creating sports entertainment and WrestleMania and all of that stuff.
Yeah, this is because Vince McMahon was a cheap bastard. And okay, because of kayfabe, what wrestling would have to do, and this was partly because the state athletic commissions. You always hear about the state athletic commissions, the New York State Athletic Commission or the New Jersey State Athletic Commission. They would have had a role to play in this anyways. But one of the ways that wrestling was made to look legit was they had oversight from the New York State Athletic Commission or the Louisiana State Athletic Commission, wherever your territory was. You worked within that state athletic commission to sanction your matches. They would always have representatives on hand at all the events. That cost money. Vince would have to pay to have, that oversight basically. And Vince didn't want to keep paying it. And so what Vince wanted to do was basically pull the curtain up and show people that this wasn't real. And so that's when he went on the Larry King show. If you remember Larry King, that's kind of a name from the past now. And he made the famous statement that he was the Walt Disney of professional wrestling. Sports entertainment was coined by Vince McMahon to kind of get around the kayfabe aspect of professional wrestling. This is why a lot of old people, old school fans, and old school wrestlers hate Vince McMahon, because he essentially killed the business as it had been. Now, we can sit here and argue both sides of the coin, whether it was good or bad that he did that. Like you were kind of talking about, and hindsight being 2020 with the internet, with communication and entertainment becoming so pervasive, and a million cable channels and social media and everything, it probably would not have survived anyway. As a matter of fact, we could definitely say that kayfabe wouldn't have survived in the internet age. But at that time, that was a major shift in this. So it was a big deal. And it's a deal that a lot of old school wrestlers still talk about today, because it's the point where the business changed. But you can even see it in the company. Whereas in 85 and 86, it still had kind of the old school vibe about it. By 87, and especially 88, kind of what you think of when you think of Hulk Hogan in the WWF in the 80s, those big arenas, the lights, the big WWF sign that hang over the entranceway, the banners over the ring. This is that point in time where we're getting away from what used to be the territory of the WWF, and now we're seeing the WWF as the national company. It's a very fascinating point in time in history. And, as Hogan alludes to, he very much had a major role to play in that. So it's really fascinating stuff, actually.
Chapter 26, WrestleMania, March 31st, 1985. Hulk Hogan talks about the first WrestleMania. He says that Paul Orndorff and Dr. D didn't like Mr. T being involved, and says that Mr. T almost no-showed the event.
That actually has been corroborated by other people. Mr. T was apparently a pain in the butt to work with. Obviously, it did good business because Vince McMahon got him back for WrestleMania 2. But yeah, there have actually been some other people that have corroborated that. Mr. T was kind of a pain in the butt to work with, and a lot of people didn't like him. But you can't argue with success. I mean, look at WrestleMania. It's about to be bid on by networks, just like the Super Bowl is every year. So, if WrestleMania 1 had failed, Vince McMahon and the WWF would have failed. A lot of people don't know that. WrestleMania is actually the only reason that there is even a WWE today. Vince was trying to go national, and he invested everything he had into WrestleMania. And if WrestleMania had not succeeded, Vince McMahon's company would have failed. And wrestling, as you know it today, would be dramatically different. So, yeah, WrestleMania, that's one reason why WrestleMania is so important to the business today. Without the success of the original WrestleMania, there is no WWE. That's even more important, technically, than any one wrestler. more important than Hogan himself. But of course, Hogan had a big part to play in the success of WrestleMania. So yeah, that's why you can't, even though Hogan had the controversy over his comments on the tape that was leaked. Say what you will about Hogan the person, you can't undersell how important he was to the business. And I don't think that's something that a lot of younger fans fully appreciate. It's not just that Hogan was a big star. Hogan carried with Mr. T the kind of the promotion of that first WrestleMania. And the success of the first WrestleMania is what led to Saturday night's main event in May of '85, and that's what led to the WWF just exploding onto the global scene. It's really weird to think that had that failed, the company would have failed. And that's very true, and it's a very real fact of life that a lot of people, even Vince McMahon himself, have talked about.
Yeah, so chapter 27, three guys I never expected to see in the same place. Hogan talks about all the celebrity guests at Mania, like Liberace, Muhammad Ali, Billy Martin, all those guys.
Yeah, that was very celebrity heavy. Early on in the first couple of WrestleManias, it was all about getting as many celebrities as you could. Even celebrities that would be considered B-list or C-list, at that time. If they were famous for any reason whatsoever, Vince McMahon wanted them. And that's why you had such a weird assortment. It was even worse or I shouldn't say worse. It was even more weird at WrestleMania 2, where you had celebrities on commentary at all three of the locations. If you've never seen WrestleMania 2, it wasn't filmed at one arena. It was filmed at three. They had a show in New York, they had a show in Chicago, and a show in Los Angeles. And when they got done with one show, they would go to the next city, and it was crazy. But, you had Elvira commentating with Jesse Ventura and Lord Alfred Hayes in Los Angeles. You had Kathy Lee Crosby commentating in Chicago. And so you had all sorts. Daryl Dawkins, famous basketball player, Chocolate Thunder. Daryl Dawkins. He was a judge, I think, for one of the boxing match they had. The NFL sent football players to have a battle royal. Imagine the NFL sending football players to wrestle today. It's just any type of celebrity tie-in that Vince could get a hold of, he would do it. And he paid a lot of money to get Liberace and Muhammad Ali to come out to WrestleMania. That's part of that investment we were talking about. It's, it was a huge investment that Vince made. He was basically putting all his chips on Hulk Hogan and came up a winner for him.
Yeah, so chapter 28, Richard Belzer, Hogan talks about the Richard Belzer incident.
Have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen the clip where he basically chokes out Richard Belzer?
Yeah, I have. It's very weird.
It's funny now because Richard Belzer is okay. Obviously, he didn't have any lasting problems from it. But if you ever watch Hogan's face, he has this "oh God" look when Belzer kind of collapses to the ground. Like for a moment, Hogan is worried that he may have just actually killed somebody on national TV. It's kind of funny in hindsight, but it was actually a very serious incident for Hogan and the WWF at the time. Vince actually paid a lot of money to Richard Belzer for that. But if you've never seen it on YouTube and you're listening, I would highly recommend going to check it out because it's quite a fascinating little story on its own.
Yeah. So continuing with the kind of the media appearances for WrestleMania 1, Chapter 29, Smashing Media Barriers. Hogan talks about hosting Saturday Night Live and appearing in Sports Illustrated. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe the first wrestler to host Saturday Night Live. I think one of the few wrestlers to even host Saturday Night Live ever.
To my knowledge, yes, you are correct. He was the first wrestler to do it, and one of the only wrestlers until The Rock did it in 1999, I want to say. 99 or 2000. I think it was 99 when The Rock hosted. But yeah, Hulk Hogan was the first, and he was the only one for a long time. But it was part of the WrestleMania tie-in, and so that kind of tied in also to Saturday Night's Main Event and how that was created because Vince kind of got in touch with some of the people at NBC thanks in part to Hogan being on Saturday Night Live. So if you grew up like I did watching Saturday Night's Main Event specials, that's one of the reasons we had to thank for that.
So chapter 30, big matches, big gates. Hogan talks about WrestleMania 2 and 3, and he says they suffered some injured ribs after the Bundy injury angle, like legit injury, I believe. And he also says that he tore his back body slamming Andre. And there was sort of a feeling of whether or not Andre would even put Hogan over to begin with.
Yeah, this is one of those moments where it's, Hogan kind of stretching the truth a little bit.
Yeah.
There was no chance that Andre wasn't laying down for Hogan in Pontiac, Michigan at WrestleMania 3. That's just an urban legend that Hogan likes to tell. Is it possible that Andre could have changed his mind? Yeah, sure, but Andre was not Bruiser Brody in the sense he didn't go into business for himself like that. Andre said he was going to lose. He was going to lose. He might have been poking fun at Hogan, like they talked about in the documentary, but that's not true. Andre was always going to lose to Hogan at WrestleMania 3.
Yeah, I can't imagine Andre not doing the job to Hogan, because I think Andre knew that Hogan was going to be like the guy in WWF.
Yeah, and Andre at this point, we talked about on the documentary that Andre had released, or the HBO released. Andre was in bad health at this point too, so there was always some concern over the last couple of years of his career that Andre might have to retire because he wouldn't physically be able to do it anymore. And so even if Andre had wanted to win, Andre was at the end of his career for all intents and purposes, and it would have made no sense for him to win because he knew that he wasn't going to be able to continue wrestling a regular schedule. There's a reason that when Andre won the championship in 1988 that he immediately handed it over. It wasn't just part of the storyline. It was, there's no way on God's green earth that Andre the Giant can carry on the schedule of the WWF champion at that era with his health issues. So, yeah, it's just hogwash that Hogan would try to claim that he was going to lose to Andre. It never would have happened that way. So
chapter 31, Hulkamania runs wild on TV. Hogan talks about Hulk Hogan's rock and wrestling and doing a music video with Dolly Parton.
The less said about that music video, the better. That's all I'll say.
I've never seen that music video, to be honest.
Do yourself a favor and don't. You are much better off for not having seen it. It's not a knock on Dolly Parton. I much admire her theme park out in Tennessee, and the chocolate candy popsicle things that they sell there that are made in her honor. I'll leave it that. But just that music video. The less said about that, the better.
Have you ever seen Hulk Hogan's rock and wrestling?
Oh yeah. A little trivia for you. If you've ever seen the TV show Everybody Loves Raymond, Raymond's brother Robert, Brad Garrett, that is the voice of Hulk Hogan on the cartoon. A little bit of trivia there. If anybody's ever seen Everybody Loves Raymond, so it was bad. It wasn't exactly the best cartoon in the world, but at the same time, it's kind of the what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of like fascinating to see Hulk Hogan become a cartoon character. It didn't last very long, but it was interesting for what it was. So,
yeah. So, chapter 32, whatever it takes. Hogan talks about filming No Holds Barred and says they came up with the end of fight scene when Rip and Zeus on the toilet.
I'm not gonna question that. This whole movie seemed like it was conceived on the toilet because that's what it was. It was needing to be flushed. That movie sucks so bad. Oh my lord, that movie was terrible.
Yeah,
But
I haven't seen it in a while. I don't remember it being great.
the only thing that is the only redeeming factor of that movie is Kurt Fuller coins the term jock ass. You know, jock ass needs to make a comeback. Like on the list of, mild curse words like peckerhead or jackass, jock ass has a real great connotation that needs to be used more often. But other than that, this movie sucked.
Hogan also talks about doing other films like Gremlins 2, Suburban Commando, and Mr. Nanny.
Those movies sucked worse. Now, Mr. Nanny, I've seen Mr. Nanny before. I used to own that tape, sadly. If you want to see Hogan in a tutu, then that's the movie for you. Suburban Commando had actually a good cast. Shelley Long and Christopher Lloyd were pretty big stars even at that point. And Undertaker, another Undertaker reference. He
Yeah,
actually was one of the villains
yeah,
in Suburban Commando. So there you go, Taker's Minion, another Undertaker reference.
yeah. We need to bring that up to Taker when we get him.
I'll be sure to get that out there for you tomorrow. I'll tell him that you wanted me to ask him about that. So
Honestly, I actually own Suburban Commando on DVD.
I can't say anything. I own Mr. Danny, so we're partners in crime on that one. So the days of VHS tapes. Good Lord, that's like a lifetime ago now.
And I like Gremlins too for what it was.
Yeah, that's not quite on the level of a Suburban Commando or a Mr. Nanny, but
No.
once you get past Suburban Commando and Mr. Nanny, Hulk Hogan's film career kind of descends into like B movie hell. So
Yeah. Like when he's doing stuff like Santa with muscles and Three Ninjas. I mean, even Muppets in Space or Muppets from Space or whatever it was called.
Yeah, the less said about Hogan's film career, the better. It's if you think Hogan's matches in late 2000s WWF was bad, try watching some of his movies from the 90s. It's just, not good, not good at all. So.
So, Chapter 33, the Trump Plaza WrestleManias. Hogan talks about Manias 4 and 5, and Savage burst attack in his arm, and nearly wasn't able to wrestle at Mania 5.
That was, if you could believe it or not, the most financially successful match that the WWF had ever run to that point, even more so than Hogan and Andre. Hogan and Savage at WrestleMania 5 was a huge deal, and it was one of the biggest matches the company would ever run until the 1990s and the Austin and Rock matches. So, in hindsight, it's kind of like one of the last great hurrahs of the golden age of Hulkamania in the 1980s was the match with Savage at WrestleMania 5. Business was still pretty good through 1989, but by 1990, of course, things kind of took a nosedive. So this is very much the end of an era, really, when we talk about WrestleMania 5 and Hogan's work at Trump Plaza.
Well, I mean, you are going to say that Psycho Sid and Undertaker and Mania 13 wasn't a huge draw.
That match is more noteworthy for the fact that poor Sid pooped his pants. And all I'll say on that front is, my God, that must have been a really awful tombstone to have to give somebody. So,
Yeah, I've seen the match. It's not great. Like, it's terrible. One of the worst WrestleMania main events ever.
yeah, until WrestleMania 33. So,
I like Taker Roman, to be honest.
it, well, we're going to kind of stray away from the subject matter, but let's just say that opinions vary on that match, and we'll leave it at that. So,
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. And hey, good thing about this, a couple other Undertaker references. It all comes back to the Undertaker.
And we're just going to have to call this Hulk Hogan and Undertaker stories too.
So, chapter 34, family. Hogan talks about his brother Alan unfortunately passing away and his kids being born.
Yep. If you are familiar with the story of what happened with Nick Hogan, then obviously you know that it's a tragedy that very real and very unfortunate for the victim in his car crash. And then Nick wound up basically missing out on a career because of it. So that is what it is on that front. I haven't heard anything about Brooke Hogan lately. I don't even know if she's still doing music or what. So things haven't worked out so well for his children, unfortunately. And I guess, given your perspective, it didn't work out so good for Hulk in the end either, with the stuff that happened in 2014 with the sex tape being released. But that's neither here nor there.
Yeah. So, chapter 35, Terror in Aisle 2. Hogan talks about the photo shoot that Stone advised him to do, and this was a photo shoot that happened around the time of Rocky 3, and it was a photo shoot that happened at Ozzy Osbourne's house, and a bunch of naked women were by Hulk Hogan. They were feeding him grapes and all that stuff. And Linda Hogan sees this in a grocery store and freaks out.
I don't have much knowledge on this one. It's one of those deals where it's, you hear this story and you're like, what the hell was going on there? But I can't say for sure one way or the other what was going on there. Ozzy Osbourne did have some connection with the WWF, though. That part is not outside of the realm of possibility. Ozzy Osbourne actually was at WrestleMania 2. He accompanied the British Bulldogs to the ring. So, I mean, it's possible, but for some reason, the naked women keep coming up in this book. It's like Hogan's trying to say something here. Boy, would that come back to bite him in the ass later on. Getting caught with a naked woman on camera. So, oh God, I just remembered that. Oh, okay. Let's get past the naked woman talk. Not that there's anything wrong with naked women. I'm just, you get what I'm. Oh God.
Let's just move on.
Next chapter. Yeah.
Let's just move on to chapter 36. More big matches. Hogan talks about Mania 6 and 7. Hogan calls Ultimate Warrior a nice guy, but a flash in the pan.
I don't think that's fair. I really don't. And again, with this autobiography, we have to, clarify this. This book wasn't written in 2017. This book is old, so the perspective has changed over time. But Ultimate Warrior wasn't a flash in the pan. He did not do well as champion, but he did do well in the company overall.
Right.
He was a big star, and so it's not really fair to call him flash in the pan, I don't think. Now, the WrestleMania 6 main event did not do as good a business as the WrestleMania 5 main event did. So, maybe Hogan's perspective is kind of unfairly influenced in that respect, but there's a big difference in there's a big drop off between WrestleMania 5 and WrestleMania 7 in terms of the business they were doing. So that might play a role into some of that. But Ultimate Warrior was very important in his era, even if he had kind of problems and controversies similar to what Hogan wound up having.
Yeah, and apparently, according to Hogan, apparently pitched the idea of Slaughter turning heel with Vince.
Well, if it was Hogan that pitched the idea, thank God. Bruce Pritchard has kind of called that into question a little bit. I think Bruce had more of a hand in that, according to him. So again, it's kind of he said deal. It's better than what we were going to get. I think everybody knows that story by now about who Hogan was originally supposed to wrestle at WrestleMania 7, correct?
Who was he originally supposed to wrestle?
He was originally supposed to wrestle Tugboat. Sheik Tugboat.
Really?
Yes, Tugboat was going to turn heel and become an Iraqi sympathizer, and he was going to wrestle Hulk Hogan. That was the original idea for WrestleMania 7. And obviously that did not happen, but Tugboat did wind up turning heel in 1991. So at least, that was kind of set up to happen. Whether it would have had the Iraqi angle attached to it or not, that's obviously, speculation. But that's long been the rumored main event that was supposed to happen at WrestleMania 7. That was going to put 100,000 people in the Coliseum, apparently.
That would have been interesting.
You can say trash. That match would have been trash. So
yeah, it would have. It would have.
It would have been bad. But it was actually the Slaughter Hogan match from WrestleMania 7. That actually was a good match for that era. So I don't want to, poo-poo on Sergeant Slaughter. If you've never seen WrestleMania 7, please go out of your way and watch that at some point because it was a good match. So it worked out.
I actually wasn't a fan of that match, to be honest.
We just have different opinions on a lot of this stuff, but I mean, it's in the eye of the beholder. Wrestling is, a subjective thing, but WrestleMania 7 overall is a good show. It's a nostalgic show for older fans too, because there was a lot of memorable angles on it. So, but to each their own, let's say.
Yeah. All right, get ready, Taker's Minion, because another mention is coming up. Chapter 37,
shizzle.
Undertaker.
I just have to throw this in there because I was watching at the time. The sheer awesomeness of the Undertaker when he first debuted, you can't fully appreciate how crazy this was. This guy scared the living crap out of 4-year-old Biff. Just absolute terrified of this guy. And when his partnership with Jake Roberts kind of came to fruition, some of the coolest wrestling from this era of WWF, of course, Hogan, Undertaker, that was one of the last big feuds that Hogan would have in the WWF before he left. He'd have a few more, 92 and 93, but the Undertaker, that was probably the last major feud that he had. So, yeah, Undertaker, very big part of Hulk Hogan's story here.
Yeah, and Hogan claims that after working with him on Suburban Commando, Hogan got Undertaker hired by WWF, according to Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, here again, this contradicts what other people have said. So, given Hulk Hogan's propensity for lying at different points, I'm going to call BS on this. I mean, I'm sure it may have played a small role, but it's pretty well documented that Paul Heyman was the guy that kind of put Mark Calloway on the WWE's radar. So,
yeah. So, Chapter 38, Steroids. Hulk Hogan admits to taking steroids started in 1975.
This is a real seedy subject. It goes into superstar Billy Graham, who kind of had a tie-in here with Hogan. You could tell from 1990 to 1992 that Hogan had gotten a lot smaller. Hogan always had a good physique. I don't want to make it out like Hogan looked like, a job guy or anything. He was never that small, but you could tell Hogan got a lot smaller, like a lot of guys did. A lot of guys got smaller, 92, 93. So, I mean, it was kind of like one of those worst kept secret type deals. But it was still a big deal. It was kind of a shocking deal at the time, and it played a big role in Vince's trial in '94, the steroid trials. So, a very famous incident in wrestling history.
Yep. So, Chapter 39, My Biggest Mistake. Hulk Hogan talks about Arsenio Hall appearance and him talking about experimenting with steroids.
That is another name from the past. Arsenio Hall used to be a very popular talk show for a time period in the late 80s and early 90s. I actually remember him going on the Arsenio Hall show. A lot of wrestlers actually did that show. Randy Savage did it a couple times. Roddy Piper, Ultimate Warrior did it one time. He actually turned the couch that he was in the studio upside down with. So you can go on YouTube and find some of those clips. It's pretty trippy to go back and watch.
Jason Voorhees did the show one time.
It was it. It's a very distinctive era. Let's just put it that way. It was a product of its time. So
yeah, that early '90s flavor, I guess.
yeah, the first half of the 1990s was the hangover from the 80s, let's say, and then the late 90s were the grunge period. Even though grunge music was before, you get what I'm saying. It was kind of the 1998. The Attitude Era was the Attitude Era for a reason. So the early 90s were dramatically different from the late 90s.
Yeah. So chapter 40, flattening out. Hogan talks about getting off steroids after the steroid trial.
Yeah, it's like we were just talking, how you could tell he was getting smaller over his career, basically.
Chapter 41, fall from grace. Hogan talks about leaving WWF. And Hogan talks about Bret Hart and denies not wanting to drop the title to Bret. Hogan says something like Bret sort of confronts him, says, Vince told me that you weren't going to drop the belt to me. And Hogan doesn't, he says that wasn't the case, that he was just going to drop the belt to Yokozuna. And Vince, all three of them Vince, Bret, and Hogan all get together, and Vince says to Bret, that's just what you thought you. So take that for what it's worth.
Yeah, that's one of those scenarios where you're never going to really know what was truly going on. The long-standing rumor was that Hogan was supposed to drop the title to Bret. Then it came out that those promises were probably just BS, that Vince may have peddled to Bret to get him to drop the title at WrestleMania 9. That's all sorts of seedy stuff. But I really can't see Hulk Hogan losing to Bret Hart in '93. So I don't ever think that was a realistic goal. I think the plan was always to put the title back on Yokozuna at some point. Just a matter of when it would happen. And it turned out to be King of the Ring. I will say this, though. That was a very weird and kind of sad ending to his career at that point.
Yeah.
King of the Ring '93, that match other people have said this better. I'm kind of aping what others have said, but it was Hogan and what he meant to the company. It ended really badly in '93. That relationship did. '94, especially with the steroid trial and everything. But hindsight being 2020, it's not so big a deal because Hogan wound up coming back. But at the time, that was a very weird and kind of sad ending to his career with the WWF. So in that respect, it is kind of nice that Hogan got to come back and have a better ending with the company. It's just unfortunate that, real life stuff, kind of supersedes the story in the ring, let's say. So.
Yeah, so chapter 42, the jet ski incident. Hogan talks about he and Bruce Beefcake getting injured in a jet ski accident right before WrestleMania 9.
There's some urban legends about this, that it wasn't actually a jet ski accident. There's rumors that it was actually Macho Man Randy Savage punched Hogan out.
Yeah, I've heard that as well.
Yeah, that's one of those deals where it's never going to be corroborated. But it's an interesting theory. I don't know how much weight it deserves, how much merit it has, but it's definitely interesting to think about. So.
Yeah, and I think Bruce Beefcake actually had to wear this protective mask for a while afterward because of that.
Um, well, what happened with British Beefcake, this is kind of weird how this kept happening around SummerSlam time. British Beefcake never had good luck in the month of August. In '88, he got removed from the Intercontinental title match because they were going to run with the Ultimate Warrior. That's when they did the famous angle with Ron Bass. The situation with Brutus and the Mask, what happened in 1990, he had a parasailing accident. I'm wanting to say it might have been Brian Blair that hit him. We talked about Brian Blair earlier. I'm wanting to say it might have been him that kind of collided with him. What happened was basically they were parasailing, and somebody's knee smashed into Brutus Beefcake's face and just completely busted it up. It was very, very serious. He had to go in and had to have surgery, put plates in his face, and that's the reason he wound up having to wear the mask. If you notice, from 1990 to 1993, Brutus Beefcake really didn't do much wrestling until Hulk Hogan came back in '93. For most of that time, Brutus Beefcake was just doing interview segments with the barbershop. That's where the famous setting where Shawn Michaels threw Marty Jannetty through the plate glass window. That's what we're talking about. That's the reason he had to wear the mask. Now, by '93, I think the mask was more kayfabe than anything. But that's kind of what the story was. The actual injury to his face was very real. It just wasn't in the ring. It was in a parasailing accident. So.
Yeah, did you know? Did you know that they have actually made an action figure of Bruce Beefcake with the protective mask?
I have never seen that action figure. That'd actually be kind of a trip to see. I I have a Brutus Beefcake action figure. It's one of those crappy LJN figures, but uh, people, you guys, you don't know how lucky action figures where they got like full movement in all their arms or whatever. The action figures that I used to grow up playing with, like the legs were glued together, and like you couldn't move them at all. So, people be lucky that you have good action figures today, because our action figures used to suck.
Yeah, so chapter 43, Last Days of the Giant, Hogan talks about Andre passing away.
There is a hell of a lot of chapters in this book now that I think back on it. That's a lot
Yeah,
of chapters.
there's 70 chapters in this book.
Good Lord. Yeah, but yeah, Andre passing away. That was a big deal. In '93, Andre passing away. He was, at that point, it's arguable whether he was a bigger star overall than Hogan was. I think Hogan had pretty much surpassed him in the mainstream. But Andre, if he wasn't still the most recognizable wrestler in the world, he was number two. So it was a very big deal when Andre passed away in '93.
Yeah. So chapter 44, turning 40 with the 50s. Hogan tells a story about Vince showing up at his 40th birthday party, which was 50s themed, and about British Bulldog backing down after saying that he wanted to beat up Vince for screwing him over.
I don't have much to add on that one. That's one of those weird ones where it just depends on who you listen to as to what you believe. But there was definitely some issues with the Bulldog at some point, but it's kind of one of those weird things where you're never going to really know what really happened there.
Yeah, so chapter 45, Thunder in Paradise. Hogan talks about filming the TV show Thunder in Paradise and entering WCW.
I have a very bitter memory of him coming to WCW. I've been on the record before that WCW in the spring of 1994 was one of my all-time favorite promotions. They had some really great storylines going with Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, Steve Austin, Cactus Jack. And then Hogan comes in. That's summer, and he just completely torches all the progress they had made. So that and Thunder in Paradise was a really bad show. So
I've never seen it.
It just it's not a great period of time, let's say, in Hogan's career. 94, 95, it was not his best work, let's say.
So chapter 46, steroids, the trial. Hogan talks about the steroid trial and denies that Vince sold him or injected him with steroids.
Again, that's one of those he said, she said type deals where, the accusations were made, but they can never be proven. What you choose to believe just depends on your perspective. You're never going to know for sure, but there's enough anecdotal evidence and circumstantial evidence out there in the ether to suggest that there were things going on behind the scenes. You have people like Bruce Pritchard that deny that. That's not my place to say Bruce is lying or Hogan's lying or whatever. But it is an interesting period of time. We'll put it that way. It's probably the most diplomatic way that you could talk about the steroid trial. It was a major event in the history of the WWF and the business overall. And Hogan had a big role in that. So it's definitely worth talking about. It's just one of those deals where you don't know what actually happened because it's just impossible to really uncover the full truth of it.
So chapter 47, Ted Turner's Traveling World Championship Wrestling Show. Hogan talks about his first days in WCW and facing Ric Flair at Bash at the Beach in '94 and Shaq making an appearance.
To their credit, they were smarter than Vince was in the fact that they actually did this match because everybody wanted to see it. To their detriment, they did it too soon. They rushed the match and they didn't have anything to fall back on. This is why we ended up getting British Beefcake and Hulk Hogan at Starrcade. Ric Flair was a babyface up until like 2 weeks before Hogan came in. So they turned him heel real quick to kind of get him ready for Hogan. Hindsight being 2020, they probably should have had Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan be tag team partners at first and then have Flair turn on them and build up the Starrcade. But, that was WCW in a nutshell. They couldn't keep it in their proverbial pants. So,
Chapter 48, Jesse Ventura. Hogan talks about his real-life rivalry with Jesse Ventura and claims that Jesse Ventura is just jealous of him.
That's a very convenient way to overlook what Hogan actually did to Jesse Ventura. So, Hogan kind of screwed Jesse over pretty badly. That's why Jesse had a problem with Hulk. Of course, Jesse Ventura has got his own issues these days, but Hogan kind of ratted Jesse out when Jesse was trying to get a union formed. So if I was Jesse Ventura, I would have been pissed at Hogan too.
So chapter 49, 2 good years and 2 better ones. Hogan talks about the NWO forming and WCW overtaking WWF.
This was a big deal. It was a very big deal. The NWO forming, this is actually what kind of re-solidified my fandom. I've told this story before. I kind of fell out of wrestling a little bit after 93. And it was just by chance that I kind of caught an episode of WCW Worldwide in 1996 and saw Bobby Heenan standing with a cardboard cutout of Hulk Hogan with the head chopped off of it. And Tony Schiavone agreeing with Bobby Heenan. And it was like, what the hell just happened? Why is Tony Schiavone hating on Hulk Hogan? And then you found out that he had turned heel and joined the NWO, and that kind of interested me. Got me interested again in wrestling. And so this was a big deal. It's hard to kind of explain. It would be like John Cena turning heel. How it was kind of fabled for years and years, and everybody wanted to see it happen, and it never truly did. And this was on that level. Hogan turning heel was unfathomable. It was just nobody could have believed that this was possible. But he did it, and it worked pretty well for a couple of years, I would say. So
Chapter 50, Son of the Giant. Hogan talks about bringing Big Show into WCW as the Giant.
Yeah, it's pretty documented, but Big Show himself has confirmed this, so this is true. Hogan wanted him in because he thought he'd be a good opponent, and say what you will about Big Show, whether you love him or you hate him, he's had an important role to play in wrestling history over the last 2 decades. So it is interesting to kind of look back at how he got his start in the business. Big Show is one of the funniest guys you'll ever hear. If you've never seen this stuff on the network where he does like Table for Three, that's well worth going out of your way to see. So the matches in '95, though, not so good, especially the monster truck match.
Oh my God.
You just know there's people going to be listening to this like, monster truck match, what the hell is that? And trust me, you don't want to know. Monster trucks allegedly on top of the arena, trying to push each other out of a circle. Big Show, who's known as a Giant in WCW at the time, gets thrown off the building, and he was supposed to come back into the arena with a fish in his tights, according to Bobby Heenan, to symbolize the fact that he had fallen in the river or something. This was god awful. It just, so bad. It was around this time where Hogan got dry humped by the guy dressed up as a mummy. So,
the Yeti.
Yeah, the Yeti. And if you don't know what we're talking about, the idea of Hulk Hogan getting dry humped on TV may sound really weird. Just Google is your friend. That's all I'll say.
Hogan talks about sparring with George Foreman for charity, where Foreman hit him so hard he lost feeling in his legs for a temporary time.
I mean, is it theoretically possible? Yes. Did it actually happen? Who knows? I mean, Hogan's not the most trustworthy guy, so can't say one way or the other. I would wager a guess and say George Foreman had a little more sense than to almost kill somebody in the charity sparring match. So,
yeah. But I mean, you know what? I'm sure everything was good afterwards. I mean, I'm sure George Foreman cooked some tasty burgers on the George Foreman grill, and everything was happy-go-lucky after that.
If you believe Hogan, he was supposed to have the George Foreman grill. That was supposed to be his endorsement, and he didn't get back to them in time.
Hulk Hogan's ultimate grill, brother.
That's a pretty good impersonation, actually. That's pretty good. Yeah,
Thanks.
I mean, hey, everybody had a George Foreman grill at some point in the early 2000s.
Oh, I still have one.
Yeah, I do too. I still use my George Foreman to cook some food every once in a while. So it's a handy dandy little machine in the kitchen.
Oh yeah. So chapter 52, Hulk Rules. Hogan talks about the album he and Jimmy Hart made in the 90s.
Oh God, I just threw up in my mouth a little bit. That album is so bad. Oh, it's so bad. Oh, I'm actually having chest pain thinking about that album. Oh.
So chapter 53, the Hasselhoff position. Hogan talks about making movies for TNT and says they own 25% of the company, much like how David Hasselhoff owned 25% of Baywatch. So take that for what it's worth.
I mean, you could go back and find TNT's financial information from that period and make your own judgments on the validity of that one. So
chapter 54, Showdown at Mega Mountain. Hogan talks about filming Three Ninjas and almost going back to WWF.
This is true. This has been confirmed by other people. He almost did go back to WWF in, I believe it was 1998. I'm wanting to say. I might be wrong on the date on that, but there was a point in time where he almost did jump back to WWF, and there were some pretty serious talks about it. But WCW wound up re-signing him, so that is true. That actually did almost happen. And you talk about dramatically changing the course of history in the wrestling business. Hulk Hogan in the WWF during the Attitude Era. It's pretty crazy to think about, actually.
Yeah, you have to wonder what would happen with that.
I I don't even know that I could fathom a guess because that's just so weird. I mean, Hollywood Hogan, the character of Hollywood Hogan would have fit in probably pretty well, but Hogan trying to keep up with Austin or Rock or Triple H or Undertaker at that point, I just don't even see how it would be possible for Hogan to even keep up. He was kind of lucky where he was in WCW. He was wrestling with some older people in the business that could work kind of a slower style. That's not to say those matches were very good. WCW, the big story on WCW was great undercards, terrible main events. It's kind of the opposite of WWF at that point in time, where WWF, the undercard was pretty garbage, but they always had fun main events with Austin and Foley and Undertaker involved. I don't even know how that would have worked out. I can't imagine it would have worked out too well because Hogan would have wanted to be the big star still. There wasn't nobody supplanting Steve Austin in 1998. That would have been, fiscal suicide for Vince McMahon to try that. So
chapter 55, helicopters. Hogan talks about his phobia of helicopters.
He so very rarely talks about this. It's one of those little random things, I guess. But he's not the only one. There have been other people that have had phobias of them too. So I'm sure Ric Flair is not a big fan of flying, to put it that way.
Probably not.
So
chapter 56, Dennis Rodman. Hogan talks about bringing in Dennis Rodman from the Chicago Bulls, about Rodman drinking him under the table. So naturally, in retaliation, Brian Knobbs beats the crap out of Rodman.
Bullshit. That never happened.
I hope it never happened.
Yeah, Brian Knobbs ain't beating up Dennis Rodman. That would have been like a huge lawsuit. That never happened. Now, the whole drinking Hogan under the table, that could have happened. And it is documented, Rodman kind of came in because he was an NWO fan. And he had, a decidedly heel character that fit right in with that aesthetic. So it was certainly an interesting period in WCW's history, but it wasn't the soundest of business strategies long term, let's say.
Yeah, and Hogan says that Rodman was a bit difficult to work with. Says that he was late to wrestling training, and he would party all night and not be able to wake up in the morning to go and do the Howard Stern show.
That probably is true. I mean, just knowing what we know about Dennis Rodman during that period, it would seem to be legit. So I wouldn't necessarily question that. That could easily have been the case. So
yeah, because he was blowing off the Bulls practices, playoffs, going through WCW.
Yeah, that's a really weird period of time too, because this is right during the heart of the final run the Bulls would have.
Yeah.
And it kind of ties into why Karl Malone would wind up coming in as well, because the Bulls would face the Utah Jazz in the last NBA Finals that Jordan would play in. I remember that series very well. So as a basketball fan growing up in the 90s, it was really cool to see like Karl Malone and Dennis Rodman get in there and do stuff. Even more so than Lawrence Taylor for the WWF at WrestleMania 11. It was kind of more topical, I guess you would say. But yeah, it's a really weird period of time with Dennis Rodman and Karl Malone coming in for WCW during that year.
So chapter 57, Jay Leno. Eric Bischoff says that everybody's jumping to the ring nowadays. Why not Jay Leno? and Bischoff and Hogan take over the Tonight Show.
Yeah, this kind of sucked.
Yeah.
Not the greatest of ideas. It was taking the Vince McMahon concept of getting a celebrity involved in the show, but it kind of hurt the credibility of the product a little bit for Hulk Hogan to be put into an armbar by Jay Leno. So,
Yeah.
you want to hear some people kind of take a crap on that match. The Road Wild pay-per-views were not very popular among the wrestlers. There's some funny stories about that show kind of out on YouTube that you could find.
So, Chapter 58, Hogan for President. Hogan talks about his publicity stunt around 98 or so about running for president. And Ted Turner says that, that kind of stuff, that's the popularity contest. And when it comes to that, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I'll say this: Hulk Hogan running for president in '99 doesn't sound like such a unfathomable idea given what happened in 2016. But
No, it doesn't.
I ain't gonna touch that one either. That's neither here nor there. So
Chapter 59, and here's where we really get into it. Like, this is like the meat of the book right here. A lot of stuff happens in this chapter. Chapter 59, A Slippery Slope. Hogan talks about the downfall of WCW and NWO splitting into different factions. Hogan has said that Vince Russo wanted him out of WCW and out of wrestling, and talks about how Vince Russo would book him in '99 and 2000. And he also talks about the infamous Vince Russo promo at Bash at the Beach 2000. And he says that he took an exception to Russo claiming that he held back guys like Booker T because, and get this, it implicated that he was a racist.
boy, oh boy, talk about your irony. Oh, you have no idea, Hulk, what's coming down your personal future pipeline. But okay, let's break this down a little bit, because I think that it's important to note, and this is for SK if he ever listens to this. We talked about this in the past, some length, about WCW 2000. WCW, Vince Russo did not kill WCW. Now, he helped end it more quickly than it would have.
Oh, yeah.
What killed WCW was a combination of on-screen and off-screen factors. It's not any one. And it's my favorite saying in life. Nothing is rarely black or white. It's almost always shades of gray. WCW spent so much money, and they were so popular in 97, 98. The infrastructure of that company with Turner and Time Warner, the merger, the financial aspect of it, and how, the money kept getting shipped all over the place. They basically, J.J. Dillon has talked about this in shoot interviews before. They basically had to have gonzo business just to turn a profit. And if business ever cooled off, then it was just going to mean the death of the company. And so on a long enough curve, WCW, it was really never going to survive long term. Having said that, one of the reasons that business went so squirrely in 98 and especially 99 was WCW did not have a strong central figure that could kind of corral everybody together and present a common vision of what the product needed to be. You had all sorts of creative control going on with Hogan and Nash, and they have say in whether they lose or whether they don't lose. That's one of the reasons Vince McMahon and the WWF wound up winning the Monday Night War. Is in WWF, what Vince says goes. And if you don't want to play by Vince's rules, then you go play somewhere else, because you're not going to bully Vince McMahon into doing something that he doesn't want to do. WCW, the inmates are running the proverbial asylum here. Hulk Hogan has creative control in his contract. He can choose who he loses to. Kevin Nash had it. Scott Hall may have had it. I think Bret Hart had it when he came in 98. Sting, I'm sure, had it. You got too many cooks in the kitchen. And WCW's product went downhill a lot in 98 and especially 99. Once you get past Spring Stampede 1999, for my money, and this is just my opinion, so it's not any sort of qualitative judgment here that's universal. Spring Stampede 99 is probably the last good WCW show. After that, the quality of the promotion it kind of tanks, and it never really recovers again from it, I don't think.
Yeah, so we move on to chapter 60, setting the record straight. Hogan says that Booker T is a talented wrestler, but who waited too long to go to WWE, and claims that Booker T held himself back.
Well, as far as WWE goes, I think Triple H held Booker T back. It's pretty well documented that Booker T kind of got screwed in 2003. I was watching the show at that time. Booker T was getting over it. It's kind of interesting, actually. They kind of did to Booker T what they wound up doing to Dean Ambrose in 2014. They had a chance to make a big star, but they had other plans, and they didn't want those plans to be changed. So even though the fans wanted Booker to win, they didn't deviate from their plans. This is kind of what I was talking about. Vince McMahon is not going to be bullied into making a change. Vince is going to do what Vince wants to do. And, Triple H didn't want to drop the title to Booker T. And he managed to convince Vince that, that wasn't the right plan. And so it wasn't that Booker T held himself back. Booker kind of was the unfortunate side effect of, bad creative direction in 2003. Now, as far as Hogan and WCW, I don't know if Hogan ever intentionally held Booker T back or not. Booker T was kind of, the calls that a lot of internet wrestling fans in that era kind of took upon themselves, especially when Chris Benoit left. Chris Benoit was kind of like the internet darling of WCW until he left in 2000. You talk about something that's changed over the years, perception of Chris Benoit, but once Chris Benoit left, Booker T kind of became that cause that internet fans kind of rallied around. And so I think that it was convenient for internet fans who never really cared for Hogan that much to kind of blame Hogan for the treatment that Booker T got in WCW. I don't know that that's 100% fair to say, because honestly, Booker T was never anything more than a mid-card guy until right up to the very end of Hogan's run in WCW. It's not like Booker T was, a main event talent in 98 or 99 even. So, it's kind of hard to say that Hogan would have even had that much interest in what Booker T was doing to actually hold him back. But in WWE, it's absolutely true that he was held back by guys like Triple H. That's just not debatable, unfortunately. So.
Hart. Hogan talks about Owen Hart, and he also talks about Bret as well.
I mean, he was at the funeral. A lot of people were at Owen's funeral. So, I mean, he probably did have some sort of relationship with Owen because they were in the same company in the late 80s. Owen was with the WWF off and on from 88 to 93 when Hogan was there. So, but I mean, Owen Hart was the kind of guy that would have a relationship with pretty much anybody because that's just who Owen was. So, I don't think there's any reason to kind of question some of those claims, honestly.
Chapter 62, the knee. Hogan talks about all his knee surgeries.
I mean, you wouldn't think that a leg drop would cause a lot of problems over the years, but, you could tell by the way Hogan kind of moves around that he's paid the price for wrestling as long as he did. He doesn't move around very good, so, it's one of those deals where I bet he wishes he had used the Axe Bomber as his finisher in hindsight, but you know, he kind of became known for the leg drops. So that's what he had to use, and he paid for it later in life, unfortunately.
Chapter 64, Hogan talks about W canceled and claims that he put the idea in Vince's head to buy WCW.
Bull snot.
Exactly.
That doesn't even warrant merit. That's so preposterous. That Vince McMahon wanted to buy WCW because WCW was available. And he's a businessman, and he saw the opportunity there. It had nothing to do with Hulk Hogan. That's just a complete fabrication.
So, Chapter 64, the XWF. Hogan talks about his brief involvement in Excitement Wrestling Federation.
A lot of younger fans may not remember the XWF. It was not around for very long. There is a really weird gray area in wrestling between 2001 and 2003 where there were different companies that were trying to kind of fill the vacuum that was left by WCW, and the XWF was one of them. If you ever listen to Wayne Ferris, aka the Honky Tonk Man, he calls it the Coke League because there was a lot of drug abuse going on, unfortunately. That's what ended up actually taking Kurt Hennig's life, drug overdose in 2000. I want to say 3 it was, or maybe 2004.
Yeah, 2003.
Yeah, so that was the XWF, was one of the companies that tried to come in and replace WCW. This was kind of pre-Ring of Honor. XWF did last a little bit, but Ring of Honor kind of really started taking shape after it was formed in 2002. By 2003 and 2004, Ring of Honor had kind of created a niche for itself. This was around the time when TNA kind of came into existence as well in 2002. There used to be a promotion out of Australia called the WWA, World Wrestling All-Stars, I believe it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, that kind of had ties with the XWF loosely. I think, what's his name? Andrew McManus, I think, was the guy that ran WWA. Can't remember for sure, but a lot of ex-WCW guys wound up working for WWA and XWF, and neither league lasted very long. It was trying to fill the vacuum left by WCW. So
Chapter 65, the look. Hogan talks about how he gets his signature look.
And I mean, say what you will about Hogan. Again, you can't argue with success. He had a character, he had a vision for it, and he made it work. And you don't have to like Hogan, or respect Hogan even to give the proverbial devil his due. Hogan, he made it work for a long time. And so you don't have to like him, but you got to give him credit in that respect. He found a way to stay relevant for long past his expiration date. So, it kind of is what it is on that front. It's definitely an iconic look, though. Can't say that it's not. That's, even to this day, despite all the controversy, you ask, the random person on the street what a professional wrestler is supposed to look like, and a lot of people will still say Hulk Hogan.
Yeah. So, Chapter 66, Return. Hogan talks about return to WWF after his dad's death, and it's sort of a deja vu, much like what happened with AWA. He started out as a heel, but he ended up becoming so popular that they pretty much had no choice but to turn face.
Yeah, they did not anticipate, how popular it was going to be for Hogan to come back, because at that point, you had, I'm not trying to say that I was the majority of the fans at this point, but people like me made up a significant portion of the audience. We had grown up watching Hulk Hogan compete, and then we stuck around with the company through the Attitude Era. We went from children in Hulk Hogan's era to teenagers to young adults by the time Hogan had come back. So there was a strong nostalgia to see Hulk Hogan back in the WWF. And this is kind of what we were talking about earlier about how in '93 it was a really sad ending to his career. This was almost like a chance to kind of do it over and kind of rectify what had gone on in '93. Um, Hindsight being 2020, it's unfortunate that they did end up pulling the trigger on the Hulk Hogan face turn when they did. They kind of hot shotted the title onto him. Did not work. Business did not react well to that. 2002 kind of went into the crapper and never really recovered. They've never gotten back to those pre 2002 levels. It's kind of weird. It's to think how wrestling has always been talked about as being cyclical and how it has its ups and downs. And I've been watching wrestling for years now, and I've yet to see them kind of recover what they had been before 2002. It never got to that level again. So it kind of messed with the storylines. It completely killed Triple H as a babyface. Whether that would have worked long term or not, they had to turn him heel. But that's some of what you've been covering here on this podcast, talking about those early shows in 2002 and 2003. This is, we're getting right into that wheelhouse of the ruthless aggression era now.
Yep. So the heat. Hogan talked about contract like in his driveway.
Can you say that again? I didn't quite catch that last part there.
Hogan talks about how he contracted the fever right before WrestleMania 18, and he even passed out for a bit in his driveway.
There's no way to prove that definitively, so you just kind of take it with a grain of salt whether that actually happened or not. But it's not quite the level of Steve Austin where it was definitively shown that yes, he was in the hospital the night before WrestleMania 19.
Yeah.
There's no way to know for sure. Did it happen? It could have happened. It probably didn't. You'll never know for sure, though.
Chapter 68, Toronto. Hogan talks about facing Rock and agrees to let him win to promote the Scorpion King. And there was also a bit of talk about where Hogan was going to wear the red and yellow at WrestleMania.
I don't know about him wearing red and yellow at WrestleMania. Now, I mean, because he was still with the NWO at that point, so it would have made sense to keep the Hollywood Hogan character going.
Yeah.
It shocked me a little bit that it took as long as it did for them to start using Real American form again. Voodoo Chili was good as the Hollywood Hogan character, but it never really fit the babyface turn. So I am kind of glad they went back to Real American in that sense. But again, it's part of that strong nostalgia. It's a lot of us had grown up. Now, I wasn't a fan of Hulk Hogan in 2002, but there were a lot of other people my age that did feel some nostalgia for him coming back, and I understood why they did what they did with him. There was no way to know that the nostalgia run was going to fade as fast as it did, but Hogan got some really big reactions in 2002 and 2003. Can't take that away from him. He was very popular at different points. The famous reaction in Montreal after WrestleMania, where it took like 10 minutes for them to stop cheering him. So, the crowds loved him, and Vince saw it and said they had to go for it, and I completely understand the rationale.
Yeah, Chapter 69, Kids Who Imitate Wrestlers. Basically, Hogan says not to try this at all. That's pretty much what it is.
I think everybody that's grown up a wrestling fan has tried to imitate wrestlers at some point, whether they're out on the trampoline or in the backyards. So it doesn't mean that it's not a stupid thing to do. Trust me. You try and take a hip toss on a trampoline and don't get full rotation and see what happens to you. But, I think everybody has pretended to be a wrestler at some point in their lives.
Yeah, so now we finally get to the very last chapter of this book. Chapter 70. What's old is new. Hogan talks about winning the title at Backlash 2002 and his then current full-time run with WWE.
I mean, it was definitely a newsworthy event when it happened. Nobody would have guessed Hogan winning the title back. Uh, as far as the match goes, it wasn't any great shakes. And 2002, especially early 2002, was kind of a really weird period. It's the transition. You're getting into the ruthless aggression era here, and
Yeah,
you're setting things up for what would kind of come later. And it's Hogan had a role to play in this period. You can't say that he didn't. Now, whether it was a net positive or net negative influence, that's entirely dependent on your perspective. But whether you enjoyed 2002, a lot of people did. There was a lot of people that did enjoy 2002 at the ruthless aggression era. There were a lot of people that didn't. It's a very polarizing era, which I think that's kind of what Hulk Hogan was. He was a polarizing figure at this point. Whether you grew up rooting for him, whether you disliked him as a teen, it seemed like everybody had an opinion. So you can't say that he wasn't topical. It was a move that Vince McMahon had to make at the time. It didn't work, but he had to try. So I can't fault him for that. But 2002, it's definitely kind of the transition from the Attitude Era into the long road to what we are now. And Hogan had a role to play in that. So you got to bring up the good and the bad in that respect.
yep. So, final thoughts on the book. What did you think about this book?
It's an interesting read. You have to take a lot of it with a grain of salt. And it's been a while since I've read it. I had forgotten how many chapters there were. The chapters themselves are not like super duper long or anything, but the thing with Hogan, it's the same thing when you watch documentaries on him. You take it with a grain of salt. As long as you go into it understanding, kind of not take everything at face value. It's a fascinating read, and it does pull up some interesting stuff about Hogan's life and his career. So, if you find it, which, I can't imagine it's still in print. I mean, maybe you can find it on Amazon or something, but is it worth the read? I would say so. I mean, it's not the best autobiography that's ever been released, but it's definitely an interesting read. If I'm not mistaken, I think he released a book a few years ago that is a little bit more up to date. It had some more of his WWE career from 2002 onward in it. But I mean, say what you will about how his career in WWE ended. Hulk Hogan's still one of the most important stars in the history of wrestling, and it's interesting to get his perspective on his career, even if you can't take it all at face value. It's worth the read, I think, if you ever did come across this book.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. The book is definitely interesting. Hogan does tend to stretch the truth a little bit at times in this book, but I think overall it's an interesting read. You know,
Yeah, I would second that. It's whether or not you like it or not depends on your perspective of Hogan. If you don't like Hogan, this book's not going to change your mind. If you do like Hogan, then it's probably just going to reinforce how you already feel. It's not going to inform your opinion either way. But it is interesting. So I think it's worth the read for that perspective.
all right. So I think that's it for this episode. So where can they find you at, Biff?
You can find me on the Twitter at Real Deal Biff. I have been kind of on a unintentional hiatus from the Queen City Express, but should be getting another episode out this weekend, and then hopefully next week we'll be back on a regular schedule. You can also listen to Taker's Minion and myself with Legends Lover on Sunday evenings, 9 p.m. Eastern on YouTube. for the Connoisseurs of Wrestling podcast. We're going to be starting a brand new series on some prominent wrestling families. We'll also be talking about our next inductee into our Hall of Fame on Sunday, so please be sure to catch that. You can find me at Cage Side Seats. It's Biff Kensington. I'm generally in the daily and nightly threads. And a quick side plug, I will be guest co-hosting tomorrow morning with Taker's Minion on the Shoot and Debris podcast. So go ahead and get a plug out for that, 11 a.m. Eastern on YouTube. Definitely be sure to check out the show tomorrow morning. So that's pretty much where they can find me. And Matt, I'll let you take it on home, buddy.
All right, so you can find me on Twitter at MetalMatt15. I also hang out on Cage Side Seats and the daily, nightly, and all that stuff. And I got some plugs that I need to do. Trying to remember all of the shows that I can plug. Shooting Debris tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern. Biff is going to be guesting on it, and that's hosted by Taker's Minion and Mr. Dr. Sinju. There's Connoisseurs of Wrestling every Sunday at what time is it?
9 p.m. Eastern.
At 9 p.m. Eastern. And Biff Kensington, Legends Lover, and Taker's Minion host that podcast. Covers old school wrestling. And is there a topic that you three are going to be discussing this Sunday?
Yeah, we're going to be starting a series on wrestling families, kind of tie into the Father's Day holiday that's coming up. We'll be talking about prominent father-son combinations, families of the business. We'll be talking about the Funks this Sunday evening. So if you're interested in Terry Funk, Dory Sr., this is going to be a good episode for you.
Nice. And we also have the Queen City Express podcast with Biff every Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, is it?
4 p.m. Eastern. That's when it's supposed to be.
4 p.m. Eastern.
Yeah. Allegedly. I haven't done it the last 2 weeks, but it will be back eventually. So.
And we also have Violent Wrestling Podcast hosted by Mox and Ambrose Alley. No set time for that particular podcast. It comes at you anytime. You never know when it's going to happen. And it's a great podcast. Definitely check it out. And Two Guys, One Sport. That's every Thursday, I believe. And so I think that's it. So anything else before we leave?
I just wanted to say thanks for having me on. It was a lot of fun. And we'll have to get you on the Queen City Express podcast here one of these days.
Totally. Thanks for being on.
No worries. Always fun to talk some wrestling. So.
Yep, and so that's all for this week. And next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern, another new episode of the Ruthless Russian Era podcast. And next Friday, we're going to be taking a look at the very last WWE pay-per-view of 2002, Armageddon 2002. So it's going to be an interesting episode to say the least. But until then, that's all for the Ruthless Russian Era podcast this week. I'll see you next time. See ya.
Take care, guys.